Simon Says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
Are you ready to supercharge your productivity? You've come to the right place. This ultimate guide to essential Excel formulas contains 3 segments. We start with how formulas work and some basic functions like sum and count, then move on to logical functions like if, and then lookup functions such as VLOOKUP. We've also made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free so you can follow along. Just click on the link in the description to get your copy.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, which as you can see we've called Excel for Beginners, Formulas Bootcamp, Drill Sergeant Ashby checking in. I have to say that after a couple of months of non-Excel webinars, it does actually feel really good to get back to Excel and dive into some formulas. And that is pretty much what this session is going to be all about. We are going to blast through a whole heap of formulas so that you have these in your toolkit when you need to perform calculations. Now, as always, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm a Microsoft IT trainer specializing in the design, delivery and facilitation of Microsoft courses, both online and in the classroom. Now, I will say that this session today is a beginner session, so I've tailored it towards people who might be new to Excel, maybe people whose knowledge of formulas is limited, or maybe even people who do know a few formulas here and there, but are really looking to expand their knowledge, pick up some tips and tricks, and also expand the range of formulas that they know. I'm going to throw in useful keyboard shortcuts, tips and tricks along the way, but we are going to start right from the beginning with the principles behind how formulas work, because this is so important to understand if you want to go forward with formulas in the future. So let's take a look at our agenda. What are we going to be covering today? Well, as I said, we are going to start out with just by talking through what exactly are formulas and functions in Excel. We're going to break down how calculations in Excel actually work, and then we're going to dive in to some of the more basic formulas. I'm going to show you how you can use sum, but we're going to do it in a few different ways. We're going to look at auto sum and how we can use autofill. I'm going to talk you through understanding operators in Excel. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by that term right now, don't worry, it will become clear a bit later on. And something that's extremely important, the BODMAS rule. And I have to apologize in advance because this is going to make you feel like you are back in math class for the Americans who are online today. No S for you guys. The BODMAS rule, so important in Excel because it helps you work out the order in which calculations are performed. I'm then going to show you what I call the big 5 basic calculations. So aside from sum, we also have average, min, max, count, and count A. So I want to make sure that you know how all of those work. And again, I'm going to show you how to use them in a couple of different ways. A very, very important topic is next, absolute versus relative referencing. Again, such an important concept to get your head around when you're new to Excel, because this runs through everything that you do in Excel when you're using formulas. I'm going to show you how you can use named ranges in formulas to make your life so much easier. And then we're going to blast through some useful functions. And these functions are all very straightforward to put together, but they're so useful. And they're the ones I find myself using all the time. So we're going to look at some really common text functions. I'm going to show you how you can do things like use the unique function to extract lists of information and also the concat function. And then towards the end, I'm going to show you some slightly more complex functions if we've got the time. So we're going to take a look at the VLOOKUP function. Now, this is generally towards the more intermediate level of functions, but it is actually very, very straightforward when we break it down. So I want to show you that and also show you how you can use some error checking functions in your formulas as well. Now, if we have any time at the end, and I'm not sure if we will, I will run through with you some if and some ifs. And again, if you are very new to formulas, then this might seem quite overwhelming to you if I go through it. But just bear with me. I'm going to try and break it down and make it simple. So we'll do that if we have the time. And then, as always, useful keyboard shortcuts, tips and tricks as we go along. So without further ado, let's come out of PowerPoint and let's switch across to our spreadsheet for today. So I just want to start out very quickly just by going through what exactly is a formula in Excel. Well, a formula performs a calculation, and formulas in Excel use something called functions. And we can use one function in a formula, or we could combine multiple functions together to perform more complex calculations. So for example, on this first worksheet here, you can see I have the months of the year and I have the quarters running across the top. And in the total for quarter one, if I click on this cell, if you glance up to the formula bar, you can see that I have a formula in here, which is simply adding up all the numbers above. And this is using the sum function in this formula. Okay, so that is an example of a formula that uses one function. And there are so many different functions in Excel, over 450 in fact. And if we jump across to our formulas tab, you'll find all your functions in the functions library just here. And they're all divided down into different categories. So it really depends what you're trying to do as to which formula you use. Now, I will say that there are probably maybe 10 to 15 formulas that you will use frequently or on a regular basis. You definitely will not get through all 450 over the course of your Excel career. At least I would hope that you wouldn't, because some of these are also very specialized towards specific industries. So industries like accounting. So 10 to 15, which you'll use all the time, as long as you know them well, you're pretty much good to go. So with all that said, let me illustrate very clearly why we use formulas. Now I'm going to scroll down so that we're underneath this table. I'm just going to type in a couple of numbers just here, 10 and 20. If I want to add up these numbers, what could I do here? Well, I could click in a cell below, and if I was to type in 10 plus 20, that's not going to work because Excel doesn't know that I want to perform a calculation. So in order to tell Excel I want to perform a calculation, we need to type an equal sign into the cell, and then I could type 10 plus 20, and it's going to give me the correct answer. But this isn't the most efficient way of doing this. Why? Well, if the number changes, or if one of these numbers changes, that formula isn't going to update. So if I change this number to 15 and hit enter, the formula is no longer correct. And that is because I've hard-coded the numbers into this formula. So a better way of performing calculations is to use the cell references. So what I could do instead is select cell C19 plus and then C20, hit enter. I'm going to get the result, but if anything changes in these cells, then that formula is going to update. So that is why we tend to use cell references as opposed to hard coding numbers into our formulas. Now I will say there will be some occasions where you do need to hard code a number in, but most of the time always use cell references. Now, I've just been adding up two numbers, which is perfectly fine, but what if I want to add up a longer list of numbers, like the list that we have above? Well, this is where I would use the sum function. So I'm going to type in equals, type in sum, and notice as I start to type this formula, Excel's IntelliSense, that is what we call Excel's kind of internal memory system, searches through all of the formulas within Excel and gives us a list of everything that matches what we've typed. So you can see I've typed in sum, and it's basically brought up every single formula that contains the word sum. So what I can do is I can actually select the formula from IntelliSense. So I can either double click on the formula to select it, or if it's highlighted, so I can see that sum is highlighted, I can just press the tab key and it's going to put in that first bracket for me. Okay, so that IntelliSense is there to help you. Now, when we're constructing our formulas, we use brackets. Everything we want to calculate goes inside our brackets when we're using a function. And note underneath, I have this little screen tip pop up, and it's showing me the different arguments for this formula, and that is what we call these. So where it says number 1 and number 2, these are formula arguments. So these are the information that's required in order for this formula to work. So basically what Excel is saying to me here, what is the number that you want to add up? What is the first number? Well, I want to add up all of the numbers above, so I can simply just select the range of numbers. C3, the 2 dots mean 2, C14. I then need to close the bracket. Another thing that's important when you're constructing formulas is if you open a bracket or a parentheses, if that's the terminology you're more used to, you must always remember to close a bracket. Hit enter and it's going to perform that calculation. How else can I use this sum function? Well, I can do this even quicker by using auto sum. So if I now want to do the same thing and add up the numbers for Q2, I can use auto sum. So I'm going to find that on the Formulas tab. You'll see here we have a big Auto Sum button. Now if I click the drop down, it's going to show me all of the functions, and these are the big 5 that I call them, the most commonly used functions that I can use with Auto Sum. So if I click Sum, it automatically selects the nearest cell range, so it makes an intelligent guess as to the numbers that I want to add up. I can see that that is correct, hit enter, and that is slightly quicker than typing in the formula. How can I make that even quicker? Well, we have a keyboard shortcut for auto sum as well. What I could do is press Control semicolon, sorry, not Control semicolon, sorry, Alt equals, and that is going to do auto sum as well, okay? Alt equals, even quicker. Hit enter, and it's going to give me that total. So 3 different ways there that I can compile a formula. Now another way that you can compile formulas, apart from actually typing it into the cell, some people prefer to use the functions dialog box. Now I'm not one of those people. I prefer to type my formulas into cells. I don't know why, it's just the way I've always done it. However, a lot of people tell me, particularly when they're learning formulas, they prefer to use the functions dialog box. So let me just show you what I mean by that. Again, up on our Formulas tab, the first button we have here says Insert Function. You can see there is a keyboard shortcut to bring up this functions dialog box of Shift plus F3. Now if I click this, this allows me to search through for all of the functions in Excel. So I could type in a brief description if I'm not sure what I'm looking for. So if I want a function that's going to add numbers, I could type in add numbers and click on go, and it's going to pull back all of the formulas which are going to help me do that. So I can say, okay, there is the sum function. Let's double click. And it opens up this little functions dialog box. Now, this is basically just the function arguments that appear underneath the formula when you're typing it into the cell, but it displays it in a slightly different way. So here, what I need to do, number 1, I can just select the cell range, click on OK, and it basically does the same thing. Okay, so it doesn't matter which method you use, whichever one you find easiest is going to work. Now, another thing we could do, and I'm just going to delete out all of these, is we could use autofill. So if we have typed in the formula, in this case the sum formula in cell C15, if we want to use this same formula to calculate the other columns, instead of typing out the formula or using AutoSum, I can simply copy the formula across to these other cells. So to do that, we use our autofill handle. And you can use this on any formula. If we click in the cell, notice in the bottom right-hand corner, I have a tiny little green square that's slightly bold. And when I hover over my mouse over it, I get that tiny little black cross. That means I'm in autofill mode, and I can simply drag the formula across to copy it. And Excel is intelligent enough to know that because I'm moving this formula across, it adjusts the cell references to make them relevant so that that formula is correct. And that is what we call relative referencing. And we're going to talk about this more when we talk about relative versus absolute. So just keep that in the back of your mind for now. Okay, so we can autofill formulas as well. The final thing I'm going to show you here is I'm going to fill total column just here as well. So let's just type in the calculation. I'm going to open my brackets, and this time I want to add C3 to F3. Close the bracket, hit enter. Another way I can very quickly copy a formula down is to highlight all the cells where I want to copy the formula to and press Control D. And that's going to copy that formula down as well. Okay, so that is how you use the sum calculation. It's the most simple formula in Excel, and it's probably the one that you will learn first. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense so far. Now, I just very quickly want to briefly discuss operators as well, just so you understand what operators are. Now, when you're performing calculations, obviously additions aren't the only things that we can do. We can also do subtractions, multiplications, divisions, all different kinds of things. So it's important to know what symbols you use or what you need to type in order to perform those calculations. So an addition is a plus symbol on your keyboard, subtraction is minus, multiplication you need to press the asterisk, and division you want that forward slash. So if I was doing something like 10 multiplied by 2, I would put the asterisk in there, and that's going to give me the correct answer. Okay, so those are the operators that you're going to be using in your calculations. Now, let me type in another little formula in here because this can come a little bit unstuck. So what if I type in something like 10 plus 6 divided by 2? What do you think the result of this formula might be? Because we could have two different answers here depending on how we read this formula. So I might say to myself, okay, I want to do 10 plus 6, which gives me 16, and then divide it by 2, which is going to give me the answer of 8. So if I hit enter, what is Excel going to give me? It gives me an answer of 13. Now, why is it doing that? Well, Excel is doing 6 divided by 2 first to give me 3, and then it's adding the 10. So there are two possible answers. So how do we get around this? If we are performing calculations, how do we ensure that we're going to get the correct answer or the answer that we're looking for each time? Well, this is where you need to understand the BODMAS rule. And I apologize to everybody for taking you back to maths class with this. Now, if I switch across to the next worksheet, I've kind of written this rule out for you. And the reason why I've written it twice is because I know that in the UK, at least in the 90s when I was at school, the rule used to be called BODMAS. I know that in the US, the terminology is slightly different. So you might know it as PIDMAS or maybe PEDMAS or something like that. So they're both basically the same thing. It's just slightly different terminology depending on where you're from. So I'm from the UK, and the BODMAS rule tells me the order that calculations are performed in. So anything in the formula that's in brackets is calculated by Excel first. It then looks for orders, so that would be something like the square root. It then calculates any divisions, followed by multiplications, additions, and then it does subtractions last. Okay, so you need to keep this rule in mind when you're putting together your formulas. So if we type in what we just had before again, so 10 plus 6 divided by 2. What I could do is change the way that Excel calculates this by adding in brackets. So I'm going to place brackets round the part that I want it to calculate first. So I want it to calculate 10 plus 6 to give me 16, and then I want to divide it by 2 to give me 8, and it does give me 8. If I wanted to calculate it again in a slightly different way, I could remove the brackets, and maybe I want to place the brackets round 6 divided by 2. So now it's going to do 6 divided by 2 first to give me 3, and then it's going to add the 10, and that gives me an answer of 13. So this BODMAS rule is really, really important, and you'll find this through any mathematical calculations that you do, not just in Excel. Now let's do something else. If I type in, let's say equals 10 plus, I'm going to say 5 minus 1 divided by 2. What do you think that's going to give me? Because I haven't added in any brackets. Well, currently it gives me 14.5. Now I'm going to add some brackets to this formula. I'm going to put brackets around this part of the formula. So how is this going to calculate? So remember, again, using our BODMAS rule, it's going to calculate the first thing in the brackets or the parentheses. So it's going to do 5 minus 1. What's it going to calculate next? Well, we have a plus and we have a division in here. So let's refer to our BODMAS rule. What comes first? Well, division comes first. So it's going to do 5 minus 1 to give us 4. It's then going to do the division, which is going to give us 2, and then it's going to add the 10. So the result there should be 12, which it is. Okay, so that is that BODMAS rule. It runs through every calculation that you'll do. With all that said, let's move on now to looking at some other calculations. And we're really going to explore what I like to call the big five. We've already seen sum. That is one of the big five, the most popular functions or formulas that you're going to construct. But let's take a look at some of the other ones, average, min, and max. Now, I can see here in this table, again, I just have some months, I have some quarters, and I have maybe some sales figures in the middle here. So I'm quickly going to do the sum calculation down here. We've already done this. We've seen how it works. I'm going to select this first column and hit enter. And then just to make this super quick, I'm going to use my autofill handle to drag that formula across. I'm also going to do the same thing here. So equals sum. Let's open brackets, select. And I want to copy that down. I'm going to highlight all the cells. Remember, Control D will allow you to copy that formula down. Now, interestingly, look in the last row here, you can see I have those fences or those gates, as I like to call them, those hash symbols. Now, don't worry too much if you see that in a cell. It just means that the cell isn't wide enough to accommodate the whatever it is you have in that particular cell. So I'm going to widen this column out by double clicking. And there you go. You can see now I can see that number. So let's now do some averages. So I want to use a formula that's going to allow me to work out the average of all sales across all 4 quarters. So for this, very simply, it's exactly like sum. We use the average function. Again, you can see IntelliSense has picked up all of the formulas in Excel which contain the word average. Open my bracket, and it is exactly the same process. We select the cell range that we want to work the average out of, hit enter, and there we go. I can select all cells, Control D to copy that down. Now the min function will allow you to find the minimum value in a range of cells. So if I want to find out which quarter had the lowest sales, I would use min. So I'm going to type in equals min, open bracket, and again I can select my cell range, close the bracket, hit enter, and there is my minimum value. Control D to copy that down. And you can probably imagine what max is going to do. It's going to show me the maximum value in a range of cells. So equals max, open bracket, highlight the cells, and there we go. Control D to copy that formula down. So very quickly, I've been able to complete all of those totals using Excel's 5 most basic formulas. And they are basic. They have one argument. You just need to tell it the cell range that you want to find the sum, min, max, or average of. Okay? Nice and straightforward, nice and simple. Let's move on to count, because there are a couple of different ways that we can use the count function. Now, the count function allows you to count the number of items in a range of cells. So here I have a little table. It has some student names and it has the test score that they've received. And maybe I want to find out how many students I have in this list. Now, this is a fairly short list. It's quite easy for me to very quickly count down. But if I had a very long list, I could use the count function, which is going to do that for me. Now, there is something you have to watch out with the count function. So if I click in cell G3, I'm going to type in equals count. Open my first bracket. My first argument is value 1. What do I want to count? Well, I want to count the number of students. So I'm going to select the range. So if I select the entire range just here, close my bracket and hit enter, I get 0. Now, why is it giving me 0? Let's put a pin in that for a second and try the same thing, but this time using the count A function instead. So I'm going to type in equals count A, open bracket. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Select the range that I want to count. At that time, it works. So what is the difference between these two? Well, count will only count cells that contain numbers. And because I chose a range that contains text, that is why it's giving me 0. Now count A, on the other hand, that formula will count everything. Count all is what it stands for. So it's going to count cells, whether they contain text, numbers, or anything else. Now, if I was to redo this formula, equals count, open bracket, this will work if I select the test scores to count instead, because those are numbers. So that is a very important distinction to make when you're using count and count A. Now, something else that's really useful for you to have turned on when you're working with formulas is I want you to turn on certain options in the status bar. So your status bar runs all the way across the bottom of Excel underneath where we have all of our different worksheet tabs. Now, if you right-click your mouse in this area, you're going to get this customized status bar menu. And what I would suggest that you do is make sure that you have these options with a tick next to them. So where it says average, count, numerical count, minimum, maximum, and sum. Make sure that you toggle those on. So click them to put a tick next to all of them. The reason why I like to have these on, particularly when I'm working with formulas, is that it means I don't actually have to do a formula in order to be able to see the average, the count, the sum, so on and so forth. Because if I have these turned on, if I simply highlight a list of data, so let's do these test scores, can you see what I can see in the status bar at the bottom? It's looking at that range and it's telling me what the average of these numbers are, what the count is, what the numerical count is, what the maximum value is, and also what the sum is. So if somebody down the corridor very quickly wants to know, oh, can you add these test scores together? I don't have to perform a calculation. I can simply highlight them, look in my status bar, and I can see that the sum of those is 415. So really useful little thing to have turned on when you're working with formulas. So with all that said, let's move along to talking about the concept of absolute versus relative referencing. This is invaluable when you're working with formulas. If you don't understand the difference, you're really going to struggle, particularly when you get into more advanced formulas. So I want us to make sure that we have a really good understanding as to what the difference is. So for this example, I have a very simple spreadsheet. I have some employee names listed in column A. I have their departments in column B. I have the number of years that employee has been at the company in column C, and I have their salary in column D. And what I want to work out here is I want to work out the bonus for these employees. And you can see over at the side here, I have the bonus listed in cell J1. So each employee is going to get a bonus of 3.5% of their salary. So what I want to do is perform a calculation where I work out what 3.5% of the salary is, and that is going to be their bonus. Now this is a very straightforward calculation. If we type in equals sum, open brackets, I basically want to do the salary multiplied by, so we want an asterisk in there, the bonus, which is in cell J1. Close the bracket, hit enter. It's now giving me the bonus. So that is essentially 3.5% of their salary. Now what I would want to do here, because I want to work out the bonus for everybody in this list, I don't want to have to go through and add in that formula. I want to be able to pull this down, copy the formula down to make this super quick. But look what happens if I use my autofill handle to copy this down. I'm going to double click to autofill down. You can see I'm getting an error. I'm not getting any details. Now, why is that? Well, if I select one of these cells down here and double click in the cell, it's going to show me the cell references that this formula refers to. So I can see currently this sum function is referring to cell D8, which is fine, that's what I want it to do, but it's multiplying by cell J7. And if you take a look at J7, it's highlighted in red in this spreadsheet, that cell is empty. So that is why I'm not getting a result for this particular calculation. So why has Excel done that? Why isn't it referring to the bonus in cell J1? Well, that is because by default, Excel uses relative referencing. So I'm just going to undo and go back to our original formula up here. Now, relative referencing means that when I drag a formula down, Excel changes or adjusts the cell references. It thinks, okay, she's moving the formula down, so she wants the cell references to also move down one each time. Now, for the salary column that I'm referring to, that's absolutely fine. But when it comes to cell J1, that's not, because if I drag down, it's going to move down to cell J2, then J3, then J4. So we need to employ something called absolute referencing in this case to get this formula to work. So I'm going to just delete out everything in here. Let's do this formula again. We're going to say equals sum, open bracket. I want to do cell D2. That is absolutely fine. I can keep that with relative referencing. I want this reference to change as I drag down. I'm going to multiply it by cell J1. Now I don't want this cell to move as I drag the formula down. I want to lock it so that it always references cell J1. And that is where we make the cell absolute. Now to do that, you can press the F4 key on your keyboard. And it's worth noting here, you can have relative referencing, which is the default, absolute referencing, which is what we're going to do in a moment, but you can also have mixed referencing. Now, I'm not going to get into mixed referencing in this session because it is slightly more advanced. I'm going to leave that for now, but just be aware that there is a third option. And to make this or cell J1 absolute, let's just press that F4 key. You can see that it puts dollar signs in front of the row and the column. Essentially, that locks the row and the column into place. I can now close my bracket, hit enter, and now if I autofill this down by double-clicking that autofill handle, you can see that that formula is working. If I go a bit further down and double-click to check to make sure it's referring to the correct cells, I can see it is. So it's referring to cell D14, but it's locked to cell J1. So that is the difference between relative and absolute. Relative, the cell references will change as you drag the formula down. Absolute means you're locking it to a specific cell. A very, very important concept to get your head around. Let's just fill out this final column for fun. I want to do the salary plus the bonus. So this is just a very simple sum calculation. I want to do salary plus we're going to do bonus just here. Enter, and then I can copy that down like so. All right, so that is the difference between absolute and relative. Let's move on now to, again, apologies, that was my Alexa going off. I don't know why it's doing that. Let's move on now to seeing how we can make our formulas a little bit simpler and more readable, easier for everybody to understand. And that is by using named ranges instead of cell references in our formulas. So each time that we've constructed a formula so far, we've been selecting a range of cells. We've been using the range. For example, I'm clicked in cell F4, which is showing me the total. If we look in the formula bar at the top, you can see it's doing a sum, D4 multiplied by E4. I'm using cell references in here. But what I could do is I could use ranges instead. So for example, in this little table, you can see I have a few different columns. I have an order number column, I have a customer column, a quantity column, price per unit, and then a total column. And I need to complete this little table over here. And the first one that I want to complete is I want to find what the average order is in monetary terms. So I basically want to find out the average of this total over here. Now I could type in average, as we've seen before. I could then select this range, F4 to F7, and that's going to give me the correct answer. What if I have a very, very long list of numbers? Do I want to keep having to go in and select the range each time? That can be a little bit time consuming. Well, a way that I can make this a lot easier is to name my range instead. So what I could do is name this entire column. So I'm going to select the total column. I'm going to jump up to that formulas tab, and in the middle here we have a defined names group. And what I'm going to say is create from selection. So it's going to create a range, and I'm going to use the name in the top row of this selection, so in this case total, as the name for the range. So let's click on OK. Now, when you create named ranges in Excel, you can find them all the way over in this little name box. If I click the drop down, you can see there it's going to show me any named ranges I have set up. So not only can I use named ranges in formulas, I can also use them for navigation reasons as well. So if I'm clicked off somewhere over here on the spreadsheet and I want to quickly jump back to these totals, I could, from the drop down, select total, and it's going to move me back to that area. Now, we've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there because what we want to do is use this range in this formula. So what I could do now is I could type in equals, average, open bracket. Instead of selecting the cell range, I can just start to type in the name of the range. So if I start to type in total, you'll see Excel's IntelliSense has at the top of the list, it's showing me there is my named range. I can double click to select it, close the bracket, hit enter, and it gives me the correct answer. So now when I look at this formula, it's a lot easier to read. It's a lot easier for anybody looking at this formula to understand exactly what I'm finding the average of. I'm finding the average of that total column. It's also a lot more efficient for you. As I said, if you have lots of numbers and you don't want to keep selecting them, create named ranges and use those in your formulas. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create named ranges for all of the other columns in this little table. So this is really quick to do. All I need to do is highlight all of the data, including those column headings, go back up to my named ranges and say create from selection. I want to use the top row as the names for my ranges and click on OK. I'm going to make sure that those have been set up by checking to make sure that they're now in this named ranges drop down, which they are. I have order, price per unit, quantity and total. So now I can use any of these in my calculations. So my next calculation, I want to find the number of orders. So because I'm finding I want to count the number, I'm going to use the count formula. Let's type in count, open brackets. Again, I could select the range, but because I've given it a name and that name is order, I can just start to type it in. I can see it there in the menu. Because it's currently selected, I can press the tab key, close the bracket, hit enter, and there I get my result. Now, another way that I could do this is I could use the F3 key to pull up all of my named ranges. So if you can't remember the name of any named ranges that you've selected and you want to use them, you can just press F3 and it's going to show you a list of all of your named ranges. So for this next one, I want to find the minimum sales. So I want to look through all of these totals and I want to know what the minimum value is. So for this, we're going to use another one of those basic formulas. We're going to type in min, open the bracket, and I could press the F3 key at this stage. It's going to bring up all of the named ranges that I've created, and I can then choose which one I want to use. So I'm looking for the minimum sales value in the totals column. Click total, close off that bracket, hit enter. Okay, so nice and straightforward. And of course, I could carry on going. I want to find the maximum sales. Again, from the totals column, I can just type it in, or I can press that F3 key. You get the idea. All right, so using named ranges, one of my biggest tips when it comes to working with formulas. Now, moving on, let's take a look at just one very quick example of how we can combine formulas together. So we've looked at all of those basic formulas, we've used them, we've had a little play around with them, we've seen how we can combine them with named ranges. But what about if we want to combine formulas together? Because the beauty of formulas is that they can be extremely simple, like sum, adding up a list of numbers, or you can combine lots of different functions together to make a really long, complex formula that does some really fancy and whizzy things. Now, obviously, all of that is going to be a little bit more advanced than the stage that we're at the moment, but I do just want to show you how you can start to combine formulas together to produce a different result. So what we're going to do here is, again, we have a little table. We have the names of some salespeople, and then we have, again, some sales results for Q1 to Q4. And I want to work out the bonus for each of these salespeople. And I can see underneath I have a little bit of instructional text. So it's telling me each salesperson gets a bonus of 10% of their highest sales for the quarter. So basically I need a formula that's going to look through all of the sales for each salesperson, find the maximum value, and then work out what 10% of that is, because that's going to be the bonus. Okay. So if we just do this visually, because I've only got a little bit of data, if we look at the values for Claire, for example, I can see very clearly that the total in Q1 is the highest sales value for Claire. So she did the most sales for Q1. Now, 10% of that is going to be around 797. So that would be the answer that I'm looking for with this formula. Okay, so how do we construct this? Because we need to use two formulas. I need to use the first formula, max, to work out what the maximum value is in my selected range. But then I want to work out what 10% of that is, and we're going to use a sum formula for that. So we're combining max and sum. So let's click in bonus. We're going to type in equals to start off our formula. Now the first function I need to type is sum. Open my bracket, and straight away we go into our max function. So we're going to type in max. Now notice here, I'm now working in the max function. If I delete that out for a moment, when I open a bracket for sum, it gives me the arguments for sum. So I'm now in my sum function. Okay. If I start to type in another formula, and open a bracket, I'm now in that formula instead. So I wanted to do the max first. The first thing I wanted to do is work out what the maximum value is in the cell range. So I'm going to select my cell range. Now, that's all I wanted to do. So I'm going to close off my bracket. Now notice that once I close off that bracket, I'm essentially closing off that max formula. So Excel then takes me back out to finish completing my sum formula. And you can see now it's asking me for my arguments for sum. So I wanted to find the maximum value, and then I want it to multiply by 10%. So all I need to do here is say multiplied by, and I am going to hard code this in, this particular one. And then I need to close off my sum formula. Another important thing to remember when you're combining formulas is that the number of brackets or parentheses that you open within a formula, you must close off the same amount of brackets or your formula is not going to work. So I opened 2 brackets and I've closed 2 brackets. Hit enter and I now get my result. I can then copy that down using my autofill handle, and if we do a quick visual check of a couple of these, I can see that they are correct. So let's say for myself, the maximum value in here is going to be Q3, and I can see that yes, that is 10% of that value. Okay, so just be aware of that format when you're combining functions together. Now we're going to do that again in a moment. I'm going to show you how to combine a couple of different text functions together. Now on this page, I really just wanted to blast through a few simple but useful formulas that you're going to use frequently. And we're going to start out with some text functions. So working from the top here, I've got some text functions here, len, left, right, and mid. And these functions are really useful if you ever want to clean up text, tidy up text. Maybe you have maybe text strings and you want to extract certain parts out of a text string. This is the kind of thing where you would use formulas. Now I'm going to do this on a very basic example. Now in cell A4, I have this text just here. So let's pretend that this is maybe some kind of part number or maybe an asset number, something like that. The first thing I can do here is I can find the length of this text string. So maybe I want to know how many characters are in a string in a certain cell. So for that, we use the text function called len. And you can see there, returns the number of characters in a text string. Open our bracket. We only have one argument, and that is the text. So where is the text that you want to find the length of? Well, it's in cell A4. Close the bracket, hit enter. I can see that this has 11 characters. What about if I want to extract the first 3 characters from this string? So maybe I need to extract the A, B, C part in my spreadsheet. Well, this is where I can use the left text function. And again, these are all so simple to use. Type in left, open bracket. Where is the text? Text is in cell A4. Comma. It's now saying number of characters. How many characters from the left do you want me to extract? So I want it to extract the first 3 characters. Close the bracket, hit enter. It's going to pull out ABC. I apologise if you can hear rain. It's just started to thunder and lightning here. So if you can hear something in the background, that is exactly what it is. Moving on. You can probably guess what's coming. We can do exactly the same to extract characters from the right-hand side this time. Again, we're going to select the text and then specify how many characters from the right we want to extract. So I want to extract the last 3. Close the bracket, hit enter, and there we go. And you can even extract things from in the middle of a text string. So again, if we use mid, this is slightly different to the other 2. We need to define where that text is, so A4. But this time we need to provide a start number. That is the next argument. So my start number, I want to extract the 1, 2, 3 part of this. So I'm going to count across 1, 2, 3, 4. The start number is number 5, the 5th character. And then how many characters do I want to extract from that 5th character? 3. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to extract the middle part. So you can use all of these to really pull things out of text strings, pull things out of numbers, all different kinds of things like that. And of course, these can get a lot more complex. You can use these in more complex formulas to perform more complex tasks. This is them in their most basic form, okay? Moving on, some other functions that I use all the time, and we are going to combine a couple of functions here. Now, what you'll see is that I have a list of names, and these names look a little bit inconsistent, a little bit weird. So you can see the first one has some inconsistent casing happening. We have capital letters for the first word, and then what we call proper case for the second word. Adam Lacey, that looks fine. Claire Smith has some weird spaces in here, and Julie Waters also has some weird spaces and some weird capitalization. So what we can do is to use text functions to clean all of this up. And again, these are the kind of functions that you'll use all the time if you maybe clean data. If you do data downloads from other systems and the data comes in a little bit strange and all over the place, you can use text functions to help you tidy it. So let's blast through these. What do they all do? Well, the first one, proper, changes a text string into proper case. And proper case is just the first letter of each word is capitalized. So if I select the text in cell A8 and change it into proper case, it's going to look like that. Lower, as you would expect, changes everything to lowercase. I'm going to select my text again. There we go. You can guess what's coming here. This is going to change everything to uppercase. Close the bracket and hit enter. Now, what does trim do? Well, trim will remove any weird spaces that you have in your words. So if you have weird spaces at the beginning or in the middle of your words, the trim function is going to remove all of those. So if I type in equals trim, open brackets, and then select my text, close brackets, it's going to trim those spaces. Now, I didn't actually have any in this one, but if I do it to this one down here, for example, I say trim and click A11, it's going to remove that weird spacing at the beginning. Okay. Now, a lot of the time you'll want to combine these functions together. So sometimes I will want to maybe make text proper case and also trim any weird spaces. So again, this is where we can start combining our functions together. So let's take that as an example. I want to trim and I want to make it proper. So I'm going to type in equals. I'm going to say proper, open bracket. I'm going to go straight into my trim function. Let's select the text, close bracket. Now, because I'm making both proper and trim, where I'm applying both of those to cell A8, I don't have any other arguments, but because I've opened up 2 brackets, I need to make sure I close off 2 brackets. So we need an extra bracket on the end there. Hit enter, and then if I copy that down, that should have changed everything so that it looks correct. Okay, so again, another example of combining functions together. Let's do something that's kind of cool. Let's use one of the newer functions in Excel, the unique function. Now, I will say that not everybody has access to this function. If you are using Microsoft 365, the latest version of Excel, then you should find that you have access to the unique function. A quick way to check if you do is if you type in unique into any cell and open a bracket, if you can see all of the arguments underneath, then that means that you have access to this function within your version of Excel. If it doesn't come up with anything, then unfortunately it hasn't been released in your version just yet. But it is such a useful function that I want to show you how it works, because previously this was actually quite hard to do. You can see here I have a list, and these items tend to repeat themselves. So we've got London twice, we've got Paris a few times, Oslo, so on and so forth. And often you'll want to extract from a list of data just the unique values. So I don't want to show the repeats, I just want to see all of the unique values. And that used to be quite difficult, but no more, because we have the unique function. And this is a simple case of opening the brackets, selecting the list, closing off the bracket, hitting enter, and it's going to produce a unique list of values. I use this all the time. It was like a godsend when they introduced this in Excel. So another really useful function for you to have in your toolkit. Let's move down and do something a little bit cool, something slightly different. How do we basically do the opposite and combine cells of words together? Now I'm going to do something a little bit different in here. What I want is I'm going to have a little drop-down list which is going to house some years. So I'm going to create a very quick data validation drop-down list. Now, this isn't really a formula, but it's always nice to show you something a little bit extra. If we go to the Data tab, across to Data Tools, I'm going to select Data Validation. And I'm going to create a list of values. Now, I want this drop-down list. I want to be able to select different years from this list. So I'm just going to type these in. I'm going to say I want to have 2018, 2019, and 2020 in this list, and click on OK. So now you see that I get a little drop-down arrow, which allows me to select different years from this list. And what I want to do is basically, I want to create, maybe this is going to be the title of a worksheet. So I want the title to say sales figures for, and then whatever year I've selected in this drop-down list. So I can do that using the concat function. This is going to allow me to join text together. So if I type in concat, open my bracket, it wants to know the first piece of text. Well, the first thing I wanted to say in this heading is sales figures, so A17, comma. Now, if I just selected whatever is in this cell, B17, and close the bracket, it's going to look like that. It's going to give me sales figures 2019 without any space in the middle. Now, I want this to have sales figures, space, dash, space, and then the year. So I'm going to edit my formula, double click or press the F2 key to edit your formula, and I'm going to add in a space in between these. So after that first comma, I'm going to say that I want to have a dash. Now I need to put this within quote marks because it is essentially text. And I want it to have a space, dash, space, quote marks, comma. So now when I hit enter, that is what it looks like. Okay, and the cool thing with this is because it's referring to cell B17, if the information changes in cell B17, this title is going to update. So if I click the drop down and change it to 2018, it's going to change in my title. So this is the kind of thing you can use if you have, a chart which refers to different years, or if you want a kind of dynamic looking title, you can use data validation along with something like this concat feature to create really nice dynamic titles, okay? So concat will join together different words. And the final thing on this page, just a few very simple date and time functions. These are really straightforward. If you want today's date to be inputted into a spreadsheet, you can simply use the today function. And this is a function that has no arguments, so we just do an open and close bracket. This will give you the date today based off of your system time. And it's worth noting that this updates automatically. So if I was to open this spreadsheet tomorrow, it's going to say the 29th of July. Okay. I can do the same with the time. So if I type in equals now, open and close my brackets. It's going to give me the date and the time. And again, this is dynamic. It's going to change depending on what the day is. Now, if you would rather have the date hard-coded in, so you just want today's date and it never changes, then you can do that by pressing Control semicolon, and that is going to hard-code a date in. Okay, so it depends if you want that date to change every single time you open the spreadsheet or if you just want to hard-code in the date. Okay, but a few little shortcuts there. So those are a whole list of different formulas that I find particularly useful. Now we've got a couple of minutes left. I am quickly going to blast through VLOOKUP just to finish with a bang and show you something a little bit more towards the intermediate end. So let's jump to our VLOOKUP spreadsheet. Now, if all of that has kind of blown your mind a little bit, if this is the first time you are using formulas, I can see how this might seem quite complicated, but it's actually not. And I will say that VLOOKUP is one of the most useful formulas that you can learn in Excel. And a lot of people tend to shy away from it a little bit because they think it is horrendously complicated. And if you break it down, it's actually not. So what is VLOOKUP? Well, VLOOKUP is a formula that allows us to look up data in a table and return a value. So what does that look like in a real life scenario? Well, I have on the screen here a list of part numbers, and I want to find out what the description for that part number is and what the price for that part number is. And on another worksheet called Catalogue, I have my parts catalogue, which shows me the part numbers, the description, and the price. So essentially, I'm going to use VLOOKUP. I'm going to say look up the part number in the catalogue and return me the description and the price. And that is where we would use VLOOKUP, that kind of scenario. The key thing here is that for VLOOKUP to work, you have to have a piece of information that's common between these two sets of data. So you can see here, I'm looking up a part number, and the part numbers exist in column 1 over here. Okay, it needs to have a lookup value essentially for this to work. So how would we construct our VLOOKUP formula? Well, let's type in equals. I'm going to type in VLOOKUP, open bracket. Look at the arguments below, quite a few of them for this formula, but don't fear, it's straightforward. The first argument, lookup value. What do I want to look up? I want to look up the piece of information that's common between the two tables, which is going to be the part number, cell B6. Comma moves us on to the next argument. It's saying, okay, where do you want me to look up this part number? What is the table? What's the table array? Well, I want to look it up in this catalogue. So I could jump across to catalogue and select the entire catalogue. Now, you can probably see I'm doing this. This would be a lot easier if I named this table as a range. Okay, you could do that if you wanted to. I'm now going to work in the formula bar because I'm now on a different worksheet. So up here, I can carry on constructing my formula. Comma. It now says column index number. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're going to look up the part number in this table. What number column do you want me to return? So I'm looking for the description. And the thing you have to know about VLOOKUP formulas is that it basically numbers columns from left to right. So the part number column is column 1, the description is column 2, and the price is column 3. So I want it to return whatever is in column 2 because I'm looking for the description. That is the column index number, comma. And the final argument, approximate match or exact match. Now remember, we're using the part number as the lookup value. So do I want to exactly look up that part number? Yes, I do. So I'm looking for an exact match. So I can type in false. That is my VLOOKUP formula. Let's hit enter. There we go. It pulls back the description like so. I can then copy this formula down using my autofill handle. Now take a look. We've got an NA in here. So what I'm guessing is that this part number hasn't been found in the parts catalogue. I can check that very quickly by going to the parts catalogue, and I'm going to do a quick find. So if I press Control F, I can search for that part number, which was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say find next. It doesn't find it. So that is why I'm getting an error. That part number doesn't exist. Now let's just very quickly do this again. We're going to do the exact same VLOOKUP formula, but this time, instead of pulling back the description, we want to pull back the unit price, okay? Now what I could do here is name this table, use a named range instead. That's going to make my life a lot easier. So I'm going to click in the table, press Ctrl A to select it all, and I'm going to give this table a name. Now, a quick way of naming ranges or tables is to just click in this name box and give it a name. So I'm going to say catalog. Enter. So now that I've named it, instead of coming in and selecting the entire table, which is time consuming, I can just use the name. Now this time I want to pull back the price, so that is going to be column 3. So let's construct our VLOOKUP. Open bracket. Our lookup value is the part number, comma, the table array. Well, because I've created a range name, I can press F3. Remember, this will show all of the ranges. I can select catalog and use that instead. That is my table, comma, column index number. Well, that's going to be 3 because we're looking for the unit price, and I still want to exactly match the part number in the table. So we're going to say false on the end. Enter. And there we go. It is as simple as that. And just to finish off before I let you go, I just want to very quickly do this just to show you another quick little formula, and that is error checking. So as you can see here where it says NA, that is fine, but it might be that I want to make this a little bit more obvious. Maybe I want it to say not found so that people are clear that the part hasn't been found in the table instead of just NA. What I can do is add error checking into my formula. So if I go up to the first formula here in cell C6, I'm going to edit it in the formula bar, and we're going to add in a little error checking formula called if NA and open brackets. Now the value is going to be produced by my VLOOKUP formula. So what I want to do is click on the end, press comma, and tell Excel what to output if the value in the cell says NA. So whenever it comes across an error, what do we want it to say? So I want it to say not found. And because that is text, we always must put text within quote marks in our formulas. So I'm going to add not found into this formula, close the bracket and hit enter. Now when I copy this down, this new improved formula, you can see it now says not found instead of the mysterious NA. Okay, as I said, this is kind of moving more into the intermediate territory, but I did want to finish off just by showing you something to whet your appetite for more intermediate sessions on formulas in Excel.
All right, guys, let's move on to taking a look at our agenda for today. Now, we're going to speak a little bit about what exactly are logical functions. I really want you to understand what you're doing when you're working with logical functions, because that's going to be so beneficial when you get on to more complex uses of logical functions. So we're going to take a look at a couple of basic examples. We're going to talk through what exactly logical operators are, and we'll take a look at the different operators that you can use. We'll start out with a very basic example just to make sure that everybody is up to the same level, and then we'll start moving into some of the more common and popular logical functions. You'll see in a moment there are quite a few of them. Some of them are only available in the newer versions of Excel. So I'm going to show you functions that are available across all versions and the ones that are the most popular, the ones that you're going to be using most often. So we're going to start out with a thorough explanation of the if function. We're going to demystify that a little bit. And then we're going to expand on that idea by combining if with two other logical functions, and or. We're going to take a look at a little bit of if with conditional formatting, because this can produce quite a nice effect in your spreadsheets. We're going to talk about nested if statements and also the if-else function. We'll take a look at some error handling with if NA and if error, and then finally we'll end with two of my favorite functions in Excel, and that is SUMIFs and COUNTIFs. And hopefully along the way you'll pick up lots of little tips and tricks and keyboard shortcuts as we run through. So that's what we're going to be covering. So if we jump out of here, and now is the time to open up the Excel file. that I sent through. So let's open up this spreadsheet and take a look at our first little example. All right, so I am working on the Logical 1 tab at the bottom, so make sure you're on that page. So let's start out by talking about what exactly are logical functions. Well, if we go up to the Formulas tab in Excel, in our Functions library, you can see we have a group here called Logical. And this is going to show you a big long list of all of the logical functions that are currently available in Excel. So there are quite a few in here. And this list has grown in recent times because we do have some new functions that have been added very recently. So things like by col and by row, those are functions that are only available for Microsoft 365 users with the latest update. So you may or may not see exactly the same list that I have here in your Excel. But some of these other ones should look reasonably familiar to you if you are a regular Excel user. So we have everybody's favorite, the if function. We have and, we have or, we have not, we have if error, if NA, if S. These are some of the more common functions and are the most popular functions that you'll use when you're working with logical functions. And we're going to focus a lot on these today. So this is where you're going to find your list of logical functions. So what exactly is a logical function? Well, it is a function that performs a test on some data and then returns a result of true or false. So what exactly does that look like in its most basic context? Well, if I was to type in 10 and let's just say 5 in 2 cells, I could perform a logical test on these numbers. What I could do here is I could say, is 10 greater than 5? That is effectively a logical test. And what I would expect here is to get the result of true. Yes, 10 is greater than 5. With formulas like this that use logical operators in the middle there, and this is what we call a logical operator, your result is always going to be either true or false. What about if I was to switch this logical operator around the other way? So now we're asking the question, is 10 less than 5? When we hit enter, of course, we're going to get an answer of false. So that is a very basic example of a simple logical test, and the output that you'll get, it's only ever going to be true or false. Now, when it comes to formulas like this and these little logical operators, there are a few different types of operator that you can use. And I actually do just have these written out on a slide just here. You may be familiar with some of these, but you can see we have all of these different operators in here. So we have equals to, not equals to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, and less than or equal to. So you can use these, and you can see in the next column we have a formula example to return a result of either true or false. So again, what we could do here is if I double click, if I was to put equals in here, so is 10 equal to 5, again, I'm going to get a result of false. Okay, so we use operators in our logical functions, and the result's going to be true or false. So with that in mind, let's delete that out and let's take a look at our first example. Now, what I have here is a list of student names. Now, these might look a little bit familiar to you. I do have, when I use these student names, which, as you can see, they are kind of like funny versions of famous people's names, sometimes people think that I just don't know how to spell the actual actor's name. That is not the case. They're supposed to be spelled wrong, just in case you're wondering. So I'm going to have these as my students. We have the subject that they sat, and then we have the pass mark that they achieved. Now, the pass mark to get a pass is 65. You can see we have that up there sitting in cell C3. And I basically want to determine who has passed and who has failed. So this is a prime candidate example for an if function. Now, sorry, for a logical function. Now, if we just take the example that we just did and use that, let's see what we get. So my logical test here would be, is the mark, we're going to say greater than or equal to the pass mark, okay? So because I'm using greater than or equal to, it also means include 65. Okay, so if they get 65, that will be included. Now, because I want to copy this formula down to the cells underneath, and I don't want cell C3 to move anywhere, we need to lock it in place by pressing the F4 key. So that in itself is a logical test. Let's hit enter. We get the result of true. And if we double click to copy down, we get trues and falses in here because we have a very simple logical statement. Now that's fine. There might be different scenarios where you actually do want a result of true or false. But in this context, it doesn't really make too much sense. It would make much more sense if I had the word pass or fail in the cell as opposed to true or false. So this is where if comes in, because that is all if is doing, is we still have the same logical test, but if will allow us to define what we want true to say and what we want false to say. So if I delete everything out of this column, I'm going to use a little keyboard shortcut here, Control, Shift, down arrow to select all of the data and press delete. What we could do here instead is type in equals if. Notice the first argument is logical test. So our first argument here is basically what we just typed in. So we're testing if this is greater than or equal to the pass mark over here, F4 to lock. That's our logical test, but when we press comma with the if function, we now get to tell Excel, okay, if the answer is true, what do you want it to say? If the answer is false, what do you want it to say? So this is where we can add a little bit of meaning into our formulas. So if the result of this test is true, so if 68 is over the pass mark, then this person, they're going to get a pass. And because that's text, we need to put it in quote marks. If it's under 65, we're going to have fail in there. And that is pretty much all if does. It allows us to attribute meaning to true or false. Now I want to copy this formula down, so another little keyboard shortcut that I love, that saves me a couple of seconds, is Control Enter as opposed to Enter. If you press Enter, it always moves you to the cell below. If you want to copy down, Control Enter will keep you in the same cell, so you don't have to then re-click back on the cell to double-click to copy down. So very quickly there, just using a simple if statement, we've managed to give meaning to those true and false results, and we can now see very clearly who has passed and who has failed. Okay, so really nice and straightforward. Now I have another little example just underneath, because sometimes some people think that you can only use text within these logical functions. So you can see here we have a pass or a fail is going to be our output. But you can also add things like calculations into your if statements as well. So instead of it saying pass, I might want it to do a sum or an average or something else like that. So let's take a look at our second example. You can see here we've just done a very short list of some sales agents, and these are their sales. Now, what we're going to say is that if they've achieved sales that are greater than or equal to 20,000, then they're going to get 20% commission. Okay, so I want to work out what the commission is going to be. In fact, I don't want that to say total, let's just say commission here. So what we can do here is we can start with our if. Our logical test is going to be if this value is greater than or equal to 20,000. Now, if that's true, they're going to get 20% commission. So I need to do a sum calculation in my true argument. Okay, so I'm going straight into sum, and what we're going to do there is simply the sales value multiplied by the commission at the top here. And again, because we're going to copy it down, we want to press the F4 key. We can close off our sum, and now we're into what we want to display if it's false. And I just want a blank in there, so I'm going to put 2 quote marks. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we should find that when the sales value is 20,000 or above, we then get how much commission that person is going to collect. If they were under, they have nothing in that cell. So the point I'm really trying to illustrate here is that when you're thinking about putting together if statements, you don't necessarily just have to think of them in the context of outputting text into a cell. You can perform calculations that apply to those true or false results also. Okay? Hopefully everybody is still with me. Lovely. Let's move across to our next example. Now in this example, we're working on the logical 2 worksheet here, if you're following along with me. We have a list of customer service agents, and I've been a bit lazy here. I've just used exactly the same names. And we've got the number of calls that those customer service agents managed to pick up in the space of a week, let's say. So quite a few calls for all of these agents. And we can also see the number of seconds that it took them to pick up the phone call. So, and then above, we have our different targets. So you can see here, their weekly target is to take 350 calls. And they have a target pickup time of 3 seconds or less. Okay, so we're going to use this data. We're going to apply some logical statements to extract what we want out of this data. So let's first do just a really basic if statement. So what I could do here is I could say if, and I could say if this value here is greater than or equal to the target, again we want to press F4, then maybe I want to output the word excellent into the cell. Otherwise, I want a blank. So very simple if statement like we did previously. When I hit enter, I can then double click to copy down, and you can see all these people who have excellent next to their name picked up more than 350 calls in a week. Now, what about if I have multiple conditions here? So what about if I wanted to extract into column E, maybe I wanted to say excellent when the agent has picked up 350 or more calls, but they've picked them up in less than 3 seconds. So effectively, I have 2 conditions there. And this is where we need to add in another logical function, and that logical function is AND. So AND will allow us to have multiple logical tests in one formula. So let's delete all of this out again. And let's work through if with AND. So what we're going to do here is we're going to type in equals. We're going to start out with if, and we're going to go straight into AND. And notice here the arguments that we have. The arguments for AND are logical 1, logical 2, logical 3, so on and so forth. And you can have many more than I'm going to show you here. We're just going to add in 2 logical conditions. You could have many more than that in this one formula. So our first logical test effectively is going to be if this value is greater than or equal to this value just here, comma. We then move on to logical 2, because and we want this value to be less than or equal to 3 seconds. So we're testing for both of those conditions. Both of those conditions have to be true in order for the customer service agent to get a result or get a rating of excellent. So we're going to close off our AND. Notice that we're now back into our if formula. So if both of those are true, they're going to get a rating of excellent. If both of those are false, we're just going to have nothing in there. Close the bracket. Control Enter to stay in the same cell, and then we can double click to copy down. Okay, so AND allows us to expand our if and include multiple conditions. Both have to be true in order to return the true result of excellent. Now we can also switch out AND. We could switch this out in the formula bar for the OR function. Oops. Like so. So what we're saying here is either one of these can be true in order for the customer service agent to get a result of excellent. So they can either have received or have taken more than 350 calls, or they've picked up their calls in 3 seconds or less. They don't both have to be true, just one of them. So if we switch this for an or condition, oops, there we go, and then double click to copy down, we should find out that more people get a rating of excellent because it's a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a little bit more leeway here. So they can either pick up 350 or above calls, or they can pick up the call in under 3 seconds. And then we have excellent in those cells. Okay, so just remember that the difference between and or, and all the conditions have to be true to return the true result, or only one of them has to be true. All right, so it's a great way of combining it with if to really give some meaning to your data. Now, with this idea, just another little cool trick that I thought I'd show you whilst we are here is I could then go a stage further. And if I really wanted to jazz this up, I could maybe add some conditional formatting into this little data set that I have just here, so that whenever a customer service agent receives a rating of excellent, the entire row highlights in the spreadsheet. And this will be dynamic. So if these numbers change, or if we add more to the bottom, it's going to update. Okay. Now, the first thing I would do here is I would normally put this into a table so that if I do add more data on the bottom, then the conditional formatting will flow down. We're not going to do that for the time being. We're just going to use this data that we have here. So let's select everything in the table. We're going to go up to the Home tab into conditional formatting. Now, we need to set up a conditional formatting rule just here. And we need to use a formula to determine which cells to format. Because basically what we want to tell Excel to do here is we want it to look in column E for the word excellent, and when it finds the word excellent, we want it to format the entire row in a color that we're going to specify. We want to make sure that we fill the entire row and not just the cell that contains the word excellent. So the little formula that we need to add here is equals, and you want to select basically in the column where the word is, so where we have excellent, we want to select that first cell. So we want to select E6, but we need to make sure that we only lock the column and not the row. Okay, so the reason why we do that is because if we locked both the column and the row, so if we made this absolute effectively, when we apply the formatting, it will only apply to one cell. It won't spread across the row. Okay, so we need to do a little bit of mixed referencing in order to get this to work. So what we're going to say is where you find the word excellent, we're going to apply some formatting. So we're going to click on format, we're going to go to fill, and let's just choose this light purple color so it matches in quite nicely. Let's click on OK, and OK again, and you can now see those light up. And as I said, everything is dynamic. So if, let's say, this was the next week, and Emma Scoe, let's say she only got 340 calls in, you can see because she no longer has excellent in her rating, she's no longer highlighted. Similarly, if Kate Grimsett takes 500 calls, she is going to get highlighted with that conditional formatting. So this is a really nice way to combine your ifs with a little bit of visual formatting to really make your data stand out. Excellent. Let's move on to our next example. Now, I can't remember if I did that. Yes, on this page as well to do it. Now, let's talk about nested if statements, because sometimes we need to put if statements inside other if statements. Now, just to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm just going to clear this conditional formatting rule. So let's go to manage rules. I'm just going to delete out the rule just to get rid of that formatting, because we're going to work on these cells again. Now, notice currently that I just have excellent in there. And the other cells which don't meet those conditions are currently showing as blank. But maybe I want this to display in a slightly different way. So maybe I want to use the pickup time to construct my if statement. So maybe I want it to say in the cell, if the person has picked up the call in less than 3 seconds, I want it to say excellent. If they picked it up in 4 seconds, I want it to say good. If they pick the call up in 5 seconds, we're going to say fair. 6 seconds, okay, and anything higher is going to be poor. Okay, so we have quite a few things that we need to add in depending on the number of seconds it took them to pick up the call. So this is where we would think about using nested if statements. Now you could, this is just a little side note here, you could do something similar using lookup functions as well. You could have all of this information in a table over here and you could do a lookup. But that isn't the focus of today's webinar. We're going to do it using if statements. So let's type in our first if. So our first logical test here is if the pickup time is less than or equal to 3. If that's true, they're going to get a rating of excellent, comma. Now, instead of adding in the false argument here, we're going to go straight into our next if. And this is why we call them nested ifs, because you have ifs inside other ifs. So our next logical test is if this cell is, what are we saying here, is equal to 4. If that is true, they're going to get a rating of good. And we basically carry on going back into another if this cell is equal to 5, then they're going to get a rating of, what should we give them for a 5? We'll give them fair. Actually, let's just give them okay, comma. Back into another if. If they have a rating of, let's say, greater than or equal to 6, then they're going to get poor because they're taking way too long to pick up the phone. So let's close off all of our if statements. Now this is one thing you have to remember here, because we've opened so many brackets, we need to make sure we close off as many brackets as we've opened. Now this is pretty simple because you can see the different colors of the brackets show you which ones are pairs. So you can see here the last one is a green bracket and the starting one next to the final if, that's also a green bracket. So the colors are there to help you out. Let's do another one. You can see that's purple, so that one's closed off. Next one's red, the next one is black. So I know that those are all closed off. So when I hit enter, I should find now when I copy this down, I now have something assigned for everything in this list. Okay, so everything that's above 6 should basically say poor. All right. So that is what we would refer to as a nested if statement. Ifs within ifs. Now, I will say that there is a quicker way of putting together nested if statements, and that is to use another Excel function called ifs. So don't get confused between the two. We have if and we have ifs, okay? Those are the different functions. Now, ifs basically allows us to perform nested if statements like we just did, but it means that we don't have to keep typing in the word if. So I'll very quickly show you an example of that, just so you can see it's very, very slightly quicker. I wouldn't say it's like groundbreaking in its speed, but it is very, very slightly quicker. So we're going to use ifs, and again, we're just going to go through our logical tests. Now, I'm not going to type them all in. I'm just going to do 3 of them. So once again, we're going to say if this cell is less than or equal to 3, if that is true, we're going to have excellent in there, comma. Now, in the last example, we would then have to go straight into our next if. Now, with this, we don't have to do that. We don't need to type in if. We can just go straight into our logical test. So again, we're going to say here, if this is, let's say, equal to 4, then that is going to say good. And then finally, this is the final one we're going to do. If this is equal to 5, then this is going to say fair. Okay, and we only have one bracket to close off. So then when we hit enter and double click to copy down, you can see that where it applies, it has entered it. So I haven't done it for all of them. Remember, it's only going to have a rating here for a pickup time of less than 3 seconds, 4 seconds, or 5 seconds. Everything else is going to have an NA error next to it because I haven't accounted for those in the formula. Okay, but you can see sort of how much simpler that formula is. Again, it saves you a few seconds, not a great deal of time, but it is worth considering if you do a lot of nested if statements. Now, I've done it this way because this column nicely moves me onto my next point about if NA and if error. These are two other logical functions that we can use to handle errors in our spreadsheets. So we have two of them. Let me just type them out so you can see what they look like. And I don't really want any formatting on that one, do I? Let's clear that format. There we go. So we have two error handling formulas that fall under the bracket of logical formulas in Excel, if NA and if error. Now you may have come across these before and you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between the two of them? Now, if NA is a formula that is very specific to a certain type of error. And you can see the error that this is specific to in this column just here. Notice we have NA errors. So if I wanted to fix these, I could use if NA. If error, we can use for any formula that we have in our spreadsheet to tidy it up. Okay, so there are lots of different types of formulas that lots of different types of errors that you can get in your spreadsheets. You can have reference errors, you can have name errors, you can have value errors, you can have NA errors. If error will deal with all of them. If NA will only deal with NA errors. Now, I've always thought that this was a little bit pointless because I don't understand why we need if NA when if error will cover all of them. But we have both functions, so let's use if NA as it is appropriate for our example just here. So maybe instead of having these NA errors all over my spreadsheet, I just want to have a blank cell in there. So what I can do here is I can go up to my formula in the formula bar, and on the front of this formula, I can simply add if NA. Okay. So now you can see underneath we have two arguments, value and value if NA. Now, because we have the if-s formula here, if I click on the value argument, you can see the value in this cell is being generated by the formula we already have there, the if-s formula. So we don't need to add anything else here. What we can do, excuse me, oh, sorry, let me just take a drink of water. Little frog in my throat there. So what we can do here is go straight to the end of the formula, press comma, and now we can tell Excel what we want to show in the cell instead of the NA error. Now you can show whatever you like in here. You can show some text. You can show a blank if you wanted to. You could show a dash or a symbol or something else. Now we're just going to have a blank. So I just want 2 quote marks on the end there. Close the bracket, hit enter. And then when we double click to copy down, you can see that that looks a lot neater. So I would recommend that if you're working in a spreadsheet, and this applies to any formulas that you're working with, not just logical formulas, any formulas, if you're doing VLOOKUPs, or if you're doing lots of other different things, often you will find that you might have you might have NA errors in your spreadsheet. Now the reason why we like to handle these errors and make them a bit more meaningful or just fill the cell with a blank is if we share a spreadsheet with other people and it just has NA errors in cells, if they're not familiar with that spreadsheet, they might think that they've broken something or something's gone wrong. They might not really understand why those errors are there. So it's always best to make them either meaningful by adding a piece of text or add a blank. And when I say add a piece of text, if we go back to the formula here, instead of a blank, I could add something in here. So I could say, let's just say no data. So that when I double click to copy this down, I'm going to get no data in the cell as opposed to just the blank. So again, it makes it a lot easier for people to understand exactly what it is that you're doing. Okay, so think about if NA, and as I said, if error is pretty much worked in exactly the same way. So I could, instead of using if NA, we could have used if error instead. So I'm just going to switch that out. The arguments are exactly the same. So we have our value being generated by our if s, and then we just need to add our value if there is an error. And because this works for all different types of errors, when we copy it down, it looks exactly the same. All right, so there isn't much of a difference between those two. It's just if NA will only deal with NA errors. So another really important thing to be aware of when you're working in Excel. Let's take a look at the final couple of examples. And as I mentioned, these are probably two of my favorite functions in Excel. And I will say, I know these are really popular with accountants and people who work with numbers a lot. They're really useful and are some people's sort of most used formulas. And that is sum ifs and count ifs. Now again, when we're talking about these formulas, these are actually logical formulas. However, if we jump up to the formulas ribbon and take a look at our logical formulas drop down, we don't see them in there. I don't know why they're not in there. I did double check to make sure that they are actually classed as logical formulas. They are because they contain if, but we just don't see them in this logical group. Now, there are 4 formulas, and I'm just going to type them out here because they differ very slightly. So it's important to understand what the difference is. And we have sum if and sum ifs, and we have count if and count ifs. So what's the difference between all of these? Well, obviously, these first 2 will do a sum, and these second 2 will do a count. Okay? But what's the difference between these 2? Well, basically, and I'm just going to say this, sum if, just disregard it. Forget sum if exists. We don't need it now that we have sum ifs. Sum ifs does everything sum if does and more. So we don't really need sum if or count if. These are the only 2 you need to remember. Now what these basically allow us to do is to perform sum or count based on conditions that we specify. So if we take a look at our data set just here, you can see that I've got a list of company names in column B, and I've got quite a bit of data here. If we go control down arrow to the bottom, we've got about 148 rows of data. We've got company name, we've got the region for that particular branch of that company. We have the amount of revenue they've generated and also profit. And what we've been asked to do, maybe my manager has asked me to analyze this data, and he basically wants to see, or he basically wants to answer these 3 questions just here. So he wants to know, what is the sum of the revenue for the company Gramercy? So this is where we can use our sum ifs formula, because we're doing a sum, but we have a piece of criteria. And that criteria, in this example, is that the company has to equal Gramercy. All right? So what would this formula look like? Well, let's type in sum ifs. Notice that we have 2 main arguments here. So sum range and criteria range 1, and then criteria, 3 main arguments. So the first argument here is, what do you want to sum? So we want to sum the revenue, okay? So what you can do here is you can go in and you can select the revenue column. Now, if you have a lot of data, you'll end up going all the way down here. You could do a control-shift down arrow to select the data, but then you find yourself scrolling up and down to try and do this formula. So what I tend to like to do first is to put this data in a table and then use table references, because it really does make you a little bit more efficient, because you're not having to scroll up and down when you're selecting your cell ranges. So let's put our data into a table. Control T. Yes, my table has headers. Let's click on OK. And I'm going to remove these banded rows because I really don't like those. So if we go up to table design, and actually a side note here, this is a little sneaky peek for you. Notice these table style colors. These are actually the new colors from Microsoft. These are the new default colors. This has just been released. It's very sort of hot off of the presses. So if you haven't got this update yet, you might want to give your Excel or your Microsoft a little bit of an update, because we have a new default color palette and also a new default font. So if you've been used to using Calibri across all of your Microsoft applications, the new default font is a font called Aptos. So look out for those. These are the new colors. I will say they are a little bit controversial. People aren't sure if they like them. I don't mind them. They are growing on me. But just be aware that at some point your Excel is going to change to be using these colors. And also your font is going to change as well. So I just thought I'd give you a little sneaky peek of those whilst we were in here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off banded rows just to make this table look a little bit cleaner. Now, I'm not going to do a great deal with this table. I am going to give my table a name. So up on the table design ribbon, in this first group just here where we have table name, I'm just going to call this, what should we call this? I'm just going to call this company sales. There we go, company sales. Now again, notice with table names, you can't have any spaces in the name, so you have to make it all one word or separate your words with an underscore and then make sure you hit enter in order to get that table name to set. So now that we have our data in the table, this makes this formula a little bit easier to construct. So if we go back into sum ifs, the first thing we want is the sum range. So what are we summing? We're summing the revenue. So because I have this in a table, notice now when I hover over the revenue column, please see I get that little black downward arrow. If I click once, it's going to select the entire column for me. I don't have to do any keyboard shortcuts. I don't have to scroll up and down selecting cells. But notice in the formula, it's now giving me what we call table references. Now, these might be something that you're familiar with, or they might not be. They're basically very similar to cell references that you might be used to, but it's using the company sales table with the revenue column. That's all that means, okay? So you have the table name first of all, and then in those square brackets, you have the column that you've selected. So we've selected the revenue column. That's what we want to sum. We now need to tell Excel what our criteria is. So our first argument here is criteria range, okay? Now, I like to think of this a little bit backwards. What is our criteria? Well, we only want to sum the revenue when the company equals Gramazon. So our criteria is Gramazon. Our criteria range is going to be the company column, where we're going to find Gramazon. So again, I can come back over to here. I can use my little black downward facing arrow and click. My criteria range is the company column in the company sales table. What is my criteria? Well, I'm looking for the company Gramazon. Now I'm just going to type this in. It needs to go in quote marks, like so. That is our formula. When we hit enter, we get the sum of revenue for Gramazon only. So it goes through, it picks out Gramazon, and it sums the revenue column. So sum ifs, really, really useful. Let's take this up a notch and add in a few more pieces of criteria. So this time, my boss wants to sum the profit for the company Gaggle, but only for the West region. So again, we're going to use sum ifs. What is our sum range? Well, this time, what are we summing? We're summing the profit column. So we're going to hover our mouse over, click once, select the profit column. Criteria range 1. Now we have two pieces of criteria here. So we need to, so Gaggle is one piece of criteria and the West region is another piece of criteria. So criteria 1, our criteria range is going to be the company again. So again, I can just click. Our criteria is Gaggle. And notice now the argument moves on to criteria range 2. So we can carry on going with multiple pieces of criteria. So for this piece of criteria, I now want to add in the West region. So my criteria range is the region column. My criteria is just bracket, enter, and we get our result. This is such a useful formula for extracting values and data. Let's take a look at one more example. This time we're going to use count ifs. Now we've only got one example here because count ifs is reasonably similar in its structure to sum ifs, but this time we're counting as opposed to summing. So this time my manager wants to count the number of branches in the South region with a profit of over 10,000. So we're going to go in with a count ifs. Now notice here it goes straight into the criteria range. We don't have a range that we're summing. For the other two, the first argument was sum range. We're not summing, we're just counting this time. So we don't have that, we just need to specify the criteria that we basically want to count. So the first piece of criteria that I want to count is for the number of branches in the South region. So my criteria range is going to be region, and my criteria is going to be South. And then my second piece of criteria is where the profit is over 10,000. So my criteria range 2 is going to be the profit column. And my criteria is greater than 10,000. Close the bracket, hit enter, and I can see that we have 20 branches, 20 records in here that meet those pieces of criteria. And we can actually test this quite easily. So if I was to, let's go to the South region, I'm going to use my filters. Let's filter for the South region. And let's also filter where the profit is greater than 10,000. Click on OK. What we should find, if we highlight all of these, take a look down in the status bar. Can you see there it says count 20? So I can check this to make sure that my calculations are working correctly. All right. Now this is another really useful little tip. If you didn't know about this, you can simply highlight things in your spreadsheet, and in the status bar you can see information about the range of cells that you've selected. So without having to perform any calculation, I can see that the average of this cell range is 15,600. I can see the count is 20. I can see the minimum value, the maximum value, and the sum. Now, if you can't see those in your status bar, all you need to do is right-click and make sure that you have a tick next to all of these down here: average, count, numerical count, min, max, and sum. And then you'll be able to highlight various different things and see that information down there. All right. So that is how sum ifs and count ifs work to extract data. So let's take a look at the time. So it's about 20 past 7 here. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So that's pretty much all I had scheduled to cover with you today. I put a bit less into this session because I feel that normally we do kind of cover a little bit too much and tend to rush through it. So I've tried to go a little bit slower today and have less topics. So hopefully it makes it a little bit easier to understand.
Welcome everybody to this month's webinar on practical uses of lookup functions in Excel. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover in this session. Now, as always, I never assume that anybody has any in-depth knowledge of whatever it is that we're covering. So I'm not going to assume that you know how lookup functions work. We are going to go through all of them, or the 3 main ones, I should say, to get you started. But I'm also going to throw in lots of tips and tricks and practical ways that you can use them. So we'll take a look at what exactly are lookup functions, and we'll then dive straight into our first VLOOKUP, everybody's favorite lookup function. We're going to talk about the difference between VLOOKUP and exact match. We're going to work through some examples. There's probably going to be some things in here, even if you are familiar with VLOOKUP, that you're not aware of. So it's definitely worth paying attention, even if you are reasonably familiar with VLOOKUP. We're then going to talk about the disadvantages of VLOOKUP, because there are a few disadvantages of using it, and then I'm going to show you alternative methods. We're also going to take a look at VLOOKUP approximate match. Now, if you're not sure what I mean at this stage by exact and approximate match when it comes to VLOOKUP, don't worry, all will become clear.
We'll take a look at how we can use lookups with data validation, one of the most useful ways to use lookups. And then we'll talk in depth about index and match to perform much more flexible lookups. And index and match are two separate functions in their own right, but they're most powerful when they're used together to perform really flexible lookups. We're going to talk about the XLOOKUP function, so one of the newer lookup functions in Excel. If you have one of the later versions, so the Excel for Microsoft 365, Excel 2021, Excel 2019, then you will have the XLOOKUP function. I'm going to show you how you can do two-way lookups, and we're also going to take a look at how we can deal with lookups where there are duplicate values involved. So again, a really nice little trick to know. So let's start out with that question. What exactly are lookup functions? Well, let's come out of our presentation and I'm going to open up the file that I just sent through. So if you don't have it open already, now is the time to fire that up. And we've got a few different tabs in this workbook. We're going to start out on the Master List tab. So make sure that you're clicked on that tab. You should see an Employee Master List in there. Now, lookup functions are probably some of the most used functions in Excel. If you ever jump onto Google and take a look at the top 10 functions to learn in Excel, you can guarantee that usually VLOOKUP will be on that list. And that's because they're so powerful in many, many different situations. And you'll find yourself using these all the time if you do a lot of work in Excel. And most importantly, if you're going for a job, employers these days will always ask for VLOOKUP skills. If your job involves anything to do with Excel, VLOOKUP is what they're going to ask you about. So it's really important that you understand exactly how they work and you can explain the difference between exact match, approximate match, what the difference is between VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, and index and match. And we're going to go through all of that today. Now, we are going to focus on three lookup functions in this session: VLOOKUP, index and match, and the newer XLOOKUP. And all of these functions help you look up information across spreadsheets, but all have their advantages and disadvantages, and you need to understand which one is going to suit which specific situation. But fundamentally, what a lookup is, what any of these lookup functions do, is they will allow us to use a piece of information to look up another piece of information. So if we start on this master spreadsheet, you can see that I just have a table of data here. We've got the employee names in column A. We have their employee IDs in column B, the department that they work in column C, and the country that they work in column D. Now, maybe I want to do something really simple. Maybe I want to be able to type an employee name over in cell H3. So let's just go for the top one here, Warren : bit of a strange name. Maybe I want to have the employee name just here, and then I want it to return the country that that employee resides in. So that is essentially what a lookup is. I can use the employee name and say, okay, in the table, find the employee name, but return the country. So we're looking across the different columns for the information, but we're using what we call a lookup value. And in this case, the lookup value is the name of the employee, Warren : Okay, so let's just take a look at what that looks like if we were using VLOOKUP. Now, one thing to mention about your lookup functions, if you're somebody who prefers to use the dialog boxes, you'll find your lookup functions on the Formulas tab. In the Functions library, they're all under this group just here, Lookup and Reference. So if I click the drop down, this is where we have all of our lookup and reference functions. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, there we have VLOOKUP. Remember, you can, with any formula, select from here, and it just gives you this little function arguments box. And some people prefer this. They find it a little bit easier because it lists out all of the arguments in this kind of helpful little box area just here. So if you prefer that, you can use that, or alternatively, you can simply type it into the cell. Now we're going to type it in. We're going to type in equals VLOOKUP, and let's just take a look at the arguments that we have here. So this is fairly standard with VLOOKUP. You can see that we have 4 different arguments. The first one highlighted in bold is the lookup value. So the lookup value is whatever it is that you want to look up in the table. Now for us, that's going to be the employee name. So we can select cell H3 just here, comma. The next argument is the table array. So this is where are we looking up this information. Now you could just select a few of these columns, or you can select the whole table. I generally tend to select the whole table, and I'll show you why a bit later on. So our table array is just going to be the entire table. So I'm just going to select everything down here like so. Okay, so A3 to D53, that is our table array. The next argument is column index number. And this is what you have to remember with VLOOKUP, is that it works using column index numbers. So if we take a look at our table has 4 columns in it. So the way that Excel looks at this table is it kind of numbers these columns 1, 2, 3, and 4, starting from the left and working to the right. So this argument here, this is where we specify what column of information we want to return. So we're looking up Warren : in the table. What do we want to return? We want to return the country in this case. So we need to provide the column index number. So that is going to be column number 4. And then we have a final argument on the end of range lookup. Now, this argument is optional because it's in square brackets, but it's also a really, really important option. The range lookup is where we determine if we're doing an approximate match or an exact match. Now, what you'll find is that a lot of people, they leave this argument off the end because they think, okay, it's optional, I don't really need it. They'll leave their formula like that. They'll close off the bracket, hit enter, and they get an incorrect answer. So you can see it's returned Germany, whereas we can see Warren : is the first name in the table. His country is actually the USA. Now that's because we haven't added on the correct argument at the end. Because by default, if we don't add anything onto the end here, it's going to do an approximate match. And in this example, that's not what we want to do. We want to exactly match the name Warren : in the table. So we need to have a false argument on the end just here in order for that to work. As soon as we do that, it then returns the correct details. Okay, so that in its most basic form is a VLOOKUP. We're using a lookup value, we're looking it up in the table, we're returning the 4th column, and we're saying do an exact match of the employee name in the table. Okay, so that is your very basic VLOOKUP. And of course, if we hit enter, if I was to change this to a different employee name, so let's go for Abel Lynch and hit enter, it's going to return, he's in the USA as well. So there we go. Let's do a different one that isn't in the USA, just so you can see, make sure this works. We'll go for Alex Terry, hit enter, that changes to UK. And you can see that, yes, that is correct. Okay, so that is a very, very basic VLOOKUP. Of course, it gets a lot more complicated as we go through. Now, let's start to take a look at something a little bit different. What I want to do here is I want to return the employee ID using the employee name. So let's change country here to employee ID, like so. And we're going to remove this out of there. So this time I want to look up the employee name and I want to return the employee ID. Now that's going to be absolutely fine. We can still use our VLOOKUP in exactly the same way. We can say VLOOKUP just here. We want to look up whatever we have in cell H3, that is our lookup value, comma. And this time for my table array, I'm going to do something slightly different here. So in the last example, I selected the entire table, but you don't have to select the entire table every time you're doing a lookup. As long as you select the columns that contain what you're looking up and the lookup value, then that's fine. So I'm using the employee as the lookup value, and I want to return the employee ID. So as long as I have the employee name and the employee ID column selected, that's absolutely fine. It will still work. So I don't have to select the entire table. I could just select these two columns just here. So let's select all of those, comma, column index number. Now, again, if you do it this way and you don't select the entire table, the column index number is going to be different. So this time we want to return the employee ID, but it's going to be whatever the number of the column is within our selection. So I have two columns selected. So the column index number I want to return is going to be 2. And then again, we have to specify if we're doing an approximate match or an exact match. Now, if I leave that off again, remember, if we don't add anything there, it's going to do an approximate match. So let's do that and see what happens. I'm going to close the bracket, hit enter. If we take a look at Alex Terry, you can see his employee ID in the table is 7785, and it is actually returning the correct one. But you'll find that some of these will be wrong. If I change this to, let's go for, who should we go for? Lloyd White. Would help if I typed that correct, wouldn't it? Oh, it still picked it up, it's fine. So Lloyd White here, 6209 6440. So it's not picking up the correct thing. Okay. Now that is because one of the disadvantages of using VLOOKUP is that sometimes it won't work unless you have your data sorted. So it would help if I actually typed this correctly. Let's do that just to make sure. So as soon as I go in and sort this employee name column, then this should update and it will work correctly. So this is one of the disadvantages of VLOOKUP, is that a lot of the time you'll get results which aren't quite correct because it requires the data to be sorted. So if we right click on this column and we go to sort, and I'm going to do sort A to Z, you can see that that employee ID changed to 6209. And if we go down and find Lloyd, there he is, 6209. So now it's correct. So this can be, or this can throw up incorrect results. Now, the way that we fixed that was to sort this first column. The other way that we could have fixed that is by making sure that we add that false argument onto the end. Okay, it's not working because we've added an approximate match. So we could either sort our data to get it to work, or we can add false onto the end and we should still get the correct result. So the point I'm trying to make there is that a lot of people, when they're first learning VLOOKUP, is that they leave off that last argument because they think that it's optional and so it's not needed, and then they get incorrect results. So just remember, if you want to exactly match what the lookup value is, you need to have a false on there, or you need to make sure that your data is sorted. Okay. All right. Now, what about if we wanted to look up information in a different column? So again, I'm going to use the employee names. We're going to use Lloyd White. But this time, instead of returning the employee ID, I want to return the department. Now, you might think that you could just double click to edit your VLOOKUP and change this argument just here. So where we're returning column number 2, we want to return column number 3 instead to get the department. Now, we're going to get a reference error. Why is that? Well, if we double click, check out our selection area. This is why when I'm selecting my table array, the second argument just here, I always select the full table. Because you can see here, I've only got the first 2 columns selected as my table array, which was fine in the last example. But now that I want to pull back a different column that isn't included in my selection, it's not working. Now I can fix this very easily. I can simply highlight my table array in the formula and then just drag this out to include those additional columns. Hit enter, and now it's going to work. So again, my point there is to be on the safe side. When you're dealing with the table array argument, always select the entire table, because then you cover yourself for if anything changes. You're not going to be messing around trying to work out why that formula isn't working. Okay, so just be aware of that. Now, what about if we have this data and this data set grows? So it's fairly common that data sets don't always stay static. We want to add more data onto the bottom. in this example, we might have more employees that we want to add to the bottom of this table. Now, if I go down to the bottom just here and I add in a new employee, so I'm just going to add in my name, and let's give myself an employee ID of 7,000. Let's say that I work in marketing and I'm in the UK. Now, if I have this VLOOKUP formula just here and I change the employee to Deb Ashby, it's not going to work. Again, if we double click to take a look at this formula, this is all related to the table array. Because check out at the bottom, it hasn't included the new entry that I've added onto the bottom. Now, again, you could fix this very easily. You could just drag this little handle down to include that new data. But a habit I would always say that you need to get into is putting your data into a table before doing any lookup formula. Because when you put your data into a table, it means that anything new that you add onto the bottom is automatically going to be included. So let's come out of here. I'm going to delete my VLOOKUP formula, and I'm going to click in my data set. And the keyboard shortcut to create a table is Control-T. You can see I have the little marching ants around the outside of my data set. So that is the data range. Yes, my table has headers. I'm going to keep that selected. Let's click on OK. Now, as soon as I put my data into a table, a couple of things happen. Notice that the formatting has changed. Also notice that I now have a brand new contextual ribbon at the top called Table Design. And this will only appear when you're clicked in the table. If I click somewhere else in the spreadsheet, you can see that that Table Design ribbon disappears because it's contextual. When I click back in the table, it reappears again. Now, from this ribbon, we can do lots of different things. This is all related to how we want to format and manage our new table. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the table style because I don't particularly like that. Let's choose something different. I'm just going to go with this one just here. Now, the only other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to give my table a name. Notice in the first group here, the properties group, where we have table name, it just says table 1. And you'll find this when you create tables in Excel, it will give it a default name of table 1, table 2, table 3. So it's all very generic. Now, you can leave it as table 1 if you want to, but it sometimes becomes a little bit difficult to identify different tables, particularly if you have lots of tables in a workbook. It's always better to give them a more meaningful name so that you know which table you're working with. So I'm going to click in table name, and let's just call this employees. And hit enter. So now, effectively, this data set is named, and I can use table references in my formula now. So let's use Deb Ashby as the lookup value. I'm going to do a VLOOKUP again. Our lookup value is still going to be the employee. The table array, now this time, because I've named the table, I don't have to go in and select. I can just type in the table name. So I've called mine employees. Notice as soon as I start to type it, it brings it up underneath. And I can press the tab key to select. That will automatically make the selection for me, which is a lot easier than making the selection manually. Comma. Column index number. What do I want to return? Well, again, I want to return the employee ID, which is column number 2. And I want to do an exact match. I want to exactly match the employee name in that first column. Now, with exact match, you can type in false, or alternatively, you can type in 0. Remember, in Excel, true is represented by 1 and false is represented by 0. So you could either have a 1 or a 0 on the end here, as opposed to typing in true or false. So I'm going to do a false, which is going to be a 0. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to pull back my employee ID. And if we just check at the bottom, you can see there it is, 7,000. And the cool thing about this is that now that we have it in a table, if I was to add somebody else onto the bottom here, so let's just add Ben, 7001, let's say he's in HR and he's in the USA. Notice the table automatically expanded to accommodate that new piece of data. So now if I was to go up here and type in Ben Lee and hit enter, the formula is still going to work and everything updates. Okay, so working with tables with your VLOOKUPs, with your lookup functions, is always going to be beneficial. It just makes things a lot easier for you. Okay, so that's a few tips when it comes to working with VLOOKUP approximate match. Now we're going to carry on using this data, but let's take a look at it in a slightly different context. We're going to jump across to the reports worksheet. Now what we have here is we have a few different reports that we want to pull out from this master list of data. So at the top here, we have a list of a few of the employees, and I want to return the department and the country. So again, if we refer back to our master list, the department and the country, these are columns 3 and 4 in this table. Now, if we go back to reports, and actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this data out of the table for this example. And this is another little tip, because people always say to me, once you put your data into a table, how do you actually remove it from the table if you don't want it in the table anymore? Well, it's really easy. You just click in the table, go to table design, and in the tools group, you just click on convert to range. And that will basically take your data out of a table and just put it back to regular data again. Okay, now I'm taking it out of there just because I think it's a little bit easier to understand when we're using cell references as opposed to table references. So what we want to do here is we want to do exactly the same thing. We want to look up each of these employees in our master list, and we want to return the department that they're in and the country. So let's give this a go using VLOOKUP and see if this works. So we're going to type in equals VLOOKUP. Our lookup value is the employee name, comma, table array. Well, we're going to jump across to the master list. Notice as soon as I switch across to a different worksheet, what happens to the formula? If you look in the formula bar, you can now see that it recognizes that I'm now on a different worksheet. It says master list, and then it has an exclamation point. And the exclamation point is simply there to separate the cell references from the actual worksheet name. So my table array is going to be everything in here. So we're just going to select all of this like so. And again, check out what we have in the formula bar. Now I'm going to leave it like that for the time being. Let's press comma, and we want to specify first of all the column that we want to return. So I want to return the department first of all, which is column number 3. And we want to do an exact match. So I can type in false, or I can simply type 0. Let's close the bracket, hit enter, and see what we get. Looks good so far. Let's copy this formula down and see if it works for all of the employees. I can see that, yes, it does work for all of them. Let's check Warren Colon. Let's go up to see what he looks like. Yes, he's in sales just there. So everything is working just here. Now, one thing to note here is that if we double click and check out these cell references, notice that when we drag formulas down, these cell references move. Okay, so for Warren Colon, A9 to D60, that's the cell reference that it's using as the table array. And if we go to our master list and scroll back up, you can see A9 starts just here. So it's basically looking at this down to A50. Okay. So as long as what we're looking for is included in this range, it's going to return the correct answer. And because we sorted this list, Warren Colon is included in this section just here. But this isn't ideal. We want it to search the entire table. We don't want it to start from down here. Okay. Now, this will happen whenever you copy your cell references down. If we take a look at the first one, A4 to D55 is what it's searching in. And if we take a look at the master list, that is correct. A4 all the way down to D55. So the first one is working correctly, but then as we pull this formula down, it modifies those cell references because it's using relative references. So for this last one, if I had, let's go back to the master list. Let's use Alex Terry instead. I'm going to switch out Warren Colon for, let's go for Alex Terry. We then get an NA error because it's looking in A9 to D60. And if we go to the master list, that's this range just here.
all the way down to, all the way down to 60. We'll go down to 63. You get the idea. But it doesn't include the range where Alex Terry is listed. Okay, so this is where we need to do one of two things. We need to either lock these cell references, make them absolute, or we need to put our master list into a table. Now, with this at the top here in this formula, where we have A4 to D55, we can simply press the F4 key once, and that is going to lock those cell references in place. So this is absolute referencing, which you may or may not have come across before. The default in Excel is relative, and what that means is when we drag the formula down, it modifies those cell references and moves them down. Now, in this case, we always want to refer to the exact same cell range in our table array argument. So we need to lock those cell references by putting dollar symbols in front of the column and the row. So now if I hit enter and double click or drag this down, you can see that I'm getting the correct result for Alex Terry. If we go back to the master list and find Alex Terry, he is in the marketing department. Okay, so just be aware of that when you're working with VLOOKUPs. You need to lock your table references, you need to lock your cell references, or you need to put your data into a table, which will effectively lock it to that table range. Okay, so another thing to be aware of. Now, again, with this, because we also want to complete the country column, what a lot of people will do is they'll grab this formula and they'll try and drag it across, which is absolutely fine, but it's not going to work. You do need to make some adjustments. So if we look at the formula now, you can see that it's looking for what we have in cell B4. Now, that's not correct. We still want it to look at the employee name in cell A4. So we can simply just replace the cell reference with A4. And then the other thing we want to change is the column that we're pulling back. So this time we're not looking up the department, we're looking up the country instead. So we want to switch out 3 for 4, and then it's going to work. So you do need to make a couple of little adjustments there if you want to drag this across. There are ways that you can get around that. A lot of people will use things like index numbers. They'll put numbers at the top here, like 3 and 4, and use those to make it a bit more dynamic. I'm not going to go into that in this lesson because we don't have time, but there are ways that you can make this a little bit more dynamic, or you can simply adjust the cell references as we've done just there. Okay, so just a couple of little tricky things when it comes to working with cell references. Let's take a look at another example. Now, in report 2, we simply want to find out if an employee exists in the master data. And we have a list of employee IDs just here. So we don't particularly want to return anything. I'm not looking to return the department or the country or even the employee name. I just want to know if these employee numbers exist in this list. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say equals VLOOKUP. Our lookup value is going to be the employee ID. Our table array. Now, we're not returning any data. We just want to look up the employee ID. So our table array in this case is just going to be this column just here, the employee ID column. So we can simply select the employee ID column all the way down to the bottom. And again, I'm going to lock these because I don't want them to move. So we're going to highlight the cell reference in the formula bar and press F4, comma, column index number. Now, I don't want to return anything else. So what I'm going to say here is I've only selected one column as my table array. So I just want it to return the employee ID if it exists in the table. So I'm just going to say return column 1 because we only have one column selected. And then on the end here, we want to do an exact match of the employee ID in the table. So we're going to have a false or a 0 on the end just here. Let's hit enter. Let's drag this formula down. And you can see that wherever the employee ID does exist in the table, it's returned the employee ID. So I can see all of those ones exist. But where it can't find the employee ID, we now have an NA error. So let's just check that. Let's take a look at employee ID 9236. Let's go to our master list. Let's click in our employee ID column. I'm going to do Control F.
And we can say, I think it was 9236, 9236. Let's try and find it. I want to search on the sheet, but I want to search in the column that I'm currently clicked in. Let's say find all. It can't find anything. So that employee number doesn't exist in this list, which is why we're getting an NA error. Now you can leave the NAs here, that's not a problem. But what we always like to say with this is that, particularly if you're going to be sharing this spreadsheet with other people, NA errors in general aren't very helpful. They're not very explanatory to other people. Somebody might open this spreadsheet and think, oh my God, did I hit something to make this go wrong? They might not understand that those errors are supposed to be there. So it's always good to add in some error handling into your lookup formulas just to make it really clear that those don't exist in the data. So if you have an NA error like this, we can use a function called if NA just to make these NA errors a little bit more useful. So let's go to the formula in cell B14. Let's jump up to the formula bar and we're just going to add on the front here if NA. And we're going to open a bracket. Now the if NA formula has two arguments. The first argument is value. If we click on value, you can see it's highlighting the entire VLOOKUP formula because essentially that formula is generating the value in the cell. So that's fine. You just need to go on the end, comma, and now we can say what we wanted to say in the cell if it finds NA. So if it's not there. So you can put whatever you like in here. Remember, text does need to go inside quote marks. So we can say not in master, something like that. Close the bracket, hit enter, and now when we copy this formula down, you can see that that makes it a lot more explanatory to anybody looking at this list. So now I can see at a glance that I need to add these two employees into the master list. Okay, so again, that is how you can combine a lookup with error handling in your spreadsheets. Really useful little thing to know. Now, a couple of things that we haven't looked at so far, we haven't really spent any time looking at the true argument when it comes to VLOOKUPs. So let's jump across to the true spreadsheet. Now, true is the default. As I mentioned, if you don't add a fourth argument onto the end, it's going to do an approximate match, which is true on the end. I will say for most scenarios, you will be using false. It's always been very strange to me that Microsoft made the default true when most of the time you end up using false. But who are we to question their wisdom? So let's take a look at how the true the true argument works on the end here. So we have a different data set, and this is just showing sales agent commission. So you can see that we have some agent names in column A. We have their salary. We then have the amount of sales that they've generated, and we need to work out the commission rate and the commission amount. So what we're going to do here, and we're going to use this little lookup table over here, and I've just called it the commission lookup table. So this table has two columns. It has sales and it has rate. And I've just put a little meaning next to this just to make it a little bit easier to understand. So what we're going to say here is that if they have sales of below 500, so in column C, if it's below 500, they're going to get a 1% commission rate. Sales between 500 and 999, 2%, so on and so forth. So the percentage increases the more sales that they've made. So why would we use a true argument here? Well, let me show you what happens if you were to use false instead. So let's go VLOOKUP, our lookup value. Well, we're looking up the sales, C5. In the table array, this little table over here, H6 to I12. And again, I'm going to press F4 to lock that in place so it doesn't move when we copy the formula down. What column do we want to return? Well, I want to find out what the commission rate is. And in the commission lookup table, that is column number 2. Now, if I was to do a false here, an exact match, and close the bracket, we're going to get NA. And if I double click to copy this down, you'll notice that for most of these, we get an NA error. Now, for some of them, we're actually getting the correct result. So what is going on here? Well, Because we're doing an exact match, it means that Excel is looking for the exact value that we have in column C in this commission table. So where we have results, so down here where we have 4%, that's where it can find an exact match. So you can see here the sales were 2,000. And if we look at our commission table, we do have a value in here for 2,000. The same here for the 2% result. The sales were 500 and we have a value that it can match of 500 in the table. The same for the last one, 5,000. It can find that in the table. But for all of these ones where we have NA, we've got numbers that don't exist in this column of this table. 2,300 doesn't exactly match. 2,700 doesn't exactly match. So this is where we would use the approximate match argument on the end. Okay, so if we go back up to our VLOOKUP formula, what we need to do here is change it from false to true. Remember, instead of typing true, we could just put a 1 on the end there. Let's hit enter, and now when we copy down, we should find that we get the result that we're looking for. So let's just double check. Let's check this one. 2,700 in sales is commission rate of 4%. And if we take a look, that's this one just here, sales between 2,000 and 299, the commission rate is 4%. Okay, so that is the difference between the false and the true argument on the end. And then, of course, to work out the commission amount, this would be a simple calculation. It's going to be 4% of their salary. So we would just do B5 multiplied by the commission rate, hit enter, and then we can double click to copy that down, and we have the commission amount. All right. So a really important distinction that you need to get your head around, because you're going to probably find yourself using both of those in different scenarios. So that is the true argument on the end. All right, let's jump back to our reports page, because we're now going to move on to talking about index and match. What you'll find is that when you start using VLOOKUP is pretty good in most situations, but there will come a point where VLOOKUP doesn't work for what you need it to do. So let me give you an example. In report 3 at the bottom here, we have some employee IDs again, and we want to return the employee name that relates to the employee ID from the master list. So let's try and do a VLOOKUP here. Let's go VLOOKUP. Lookup value is the employee ID. Table array, okay, this is good. Let's go across to the master list. Not a problem, we can select everything in this table. Let's select the whole lot. And I'm going to lock this cell reference so it doesn't move. Press F4. Comma, column index number. What am I going to put here? Because column, the employee ID it's not to the right of the employee name. It's to the left instead. So what would I put in here? -1 maybe? Let's try that. Let's do an exact match. Is this going to work? No, it's not. Now, if that's confused you a little bit, why I've put a -1 in here, let's go back to the master list and take a look at this. We're using the employee ID as our lookup value. And in the master list, the employee ID is in column 2. This is the second disadvantage of using VLOOKUP, because it can only count columns from left to right. So if I wanted to use the employee ID to look up the department or the country, no problem, because I can do my VLOOKUP and the column index number is going to be 2 or 3. But if I want to look up the employee name, because it's effectively behind the lookup value, I can't type in -1 as my column number. So we can't use VLOOKUP to look both ways in a data set. It can only really look up from left to right. Okay, so a much more flexible way of doing a lookup is to utilize index and match. And you may have used these previously in different scenarios. They are two Excel functions in their own right. So let's look at them individually first of all, and then I'll show you how you can combine them together to do a much more flexible and powerful lookup. So let's jump across to the index and match worksheet. We have a different data set here. Again, we have some customer names, we have some order IDs, we have the items that they've purchased, the quantity, the price per item, and then the total, which just contains a sum calculation. Now, what I want to be able to do is I want to type in an order ID up here. So let's say 1003, and I want it to return which customer relates to that order ID. Now, currently, because order ID is in the second column and I want to return something that is to the left of it, VLOOKUP is not going to work because we can't count back columns. So I need to go about this in a different way. So let's take a look at index first of all and make sure we understand what that does. Now, with this index function, it all looks a little bit complicated when you see these arguments come up. We're using the one in the top row. The first argument is array. Now, the way that I remember this is the first argument of index is always the range of cells that contains what you want to return. So I want to return the customer name. So I'm going to index this array just here, comma. The next argument is row number. So it's asking me to provide the row number so that it can tell me which customer it relates to. Now, I have a very small data set. I'm looking for order ID 1003. So if I look at my selection here, I can see that 1003, that's in the third row. Okay, so I'm going to type in 3. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it returns the correct result. Gail Kane is order number 1003. So that works, but it's very manual. I'm having to provide the row number. Now, in a small data set like this one, that isn't too much of a problem, but imagine if I had 100,000 rows. Do I really want to sit there spending my time counting down manually to work out what row I want to return? Now, of course, there are ways that you could automate that, but I don't really want to do that. So let's take a look at what match does with that in mind. So this time, if we type in match, this is where we can look up a value, and match will actually return to us the row number. What we can say here is lookup value is the order ID, lookup array. So this is where are we looking it up? So I'm going to look up the order ID in this column just here. Match type, I want to do an exact match. So I want to exactly match that order ID. Let's close the bracket, hit enter, and you can see it's telling me that it exists in row 3. So the match function is automating the finding of the row number, so we can use both index and match together to perform a lookup. So let's combine all of that together. We're going to do index, our array. Remember, that's what we want to return. In this case, the customer. We're going to index this column, comma, row number. We're going to get match to do it for us. Lookup value, comma, lookup array, where we're going to find that lookup value. That's in this range just here. And we want to do an exact match. We then need to close off our match formula, close off our index, hit enter, and there it provides the result. And it doesn't matter if this changes. If I change this to something else, you can see it's going to pull back the correct details. And this is a much more powerful way of performing a lookup, because index and match can look anywhere in the table. It doesn't matter where your lookup value is in relation to what you're trying to return. VLOOKUP has a limitation. Okay, so get into the habit of using index and match over VLOOKUP because it is so much more powerful. Now, something else I would probably do here is instead of typing in these numbers all the time, I would put these in a data validation drop-down list. So, for example, let's delete that out. Instead of typing in my numbers all the time, I would put this in a table. So let's do Control T. Yes, my table has headers. I would give this table a name. So let's call this, we're going to call this customers at the top here. And then I would set up a data validation list so that I don't have to keep typing in my order IDs. So let's go to data. Let's go to data validation. We're going to create ourselves a list, and the source for our list is going to be the order ID column. Click on OK, and now I can select my numbers from a drop down, and it just makes everything a lot easier to work with. And the cool thing about this is that if I were to add some more data onto the bottom, because I've put it into a table, everything is going to update, and as soon as I add that row in, you can see 1013 is now there to select. Okay, so everything feeds through nicely. It's going to save you a lot of time. So that is index and match. If we go back to our reports page, I would now use index and match to pull through this data as opposed to the lookup. Okay, so let's go for now. I'm not going to do that just there, because I want to show you, before we do that, I want to show you a simpler way of doing index and match. Because if you've looked at what we've just done just there and thought, I'm never going to remember that, that's really complicated, this is where XLOOKUP is your best friend. Now, as I mentioned, XLOOKUP is one of the newer functions in Excel. If you're not sure if you have it, if you type in equals into any cell and start to type in XLOOKUP, if you can see it underneath, like mine is there, and you can see all of the arguments, then you have XLOOKUP in your version of Excel. If you can't see any arguments, then you don't have it. You'll need to use index and match instead. But XLOOKUP is a more complex and an easier version of index and match. So let me show you how easy this is using XLOOKUP instead. So let's go back to our reports page. Again, we're going to use the employee ID to look up the employee name, but we're going to use XLOOKUP. So let's go for XLOOKUP. Lookup value, A25, comma, lookup array. So where are we looking this up? Well, we're looking it up, if we go across to the master list, in the employee ID column. So I can simply select all of the values in this column. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut, Control Shift down arrow, to select everything. Again, if this isn't in a table, you want to lock your cell references at the top here by pressing F4, comma. The next argument is simply the return array. So what do we want to return? We want to return the employee name. So again, we simply go across to our master list and we can simply select the employee name column. Control Shift down arrow. Once again, F4 to lock. That is pretty much it. That is your basic XLOOKUP. Let's hit enter. You can see we get the correct result. Double click to copy down. So XLOOKUP is a much simpler way, and it's as flexible as index and match, but it's just a lot easier to put together than index and match. Okay, so if you do have XLOOKUP, it's definitely worth having a play around with it. Another thing with XLOOKUP is that it can do other things. We have more arguments, and we're going to finish the lesson because I think we've got about 9 minutes left by just taking a look at a couple of the other arguments that we can use XLOOKUP with. So if we go across to the XLOOKUP worksheet, this is where we can use XLOOKUP in a much more complex way. Now you can see here, we have a table and we effectively need to perform a two-way lookup just here. So I have some travel companies listed down in column B, and then we have some months of the year running across the top. So let's say that these are sales figures for 2022. And at the bottom here, we need to create a report that where we can look up the company and the month and produce the sales amount. And what I've done is I've put these in data validation drop-down lists already. So you can see that we have the companies listed in little data validation drop-down, but also the months as well. So what Excel needs to do here is it needs to do a two-way lookup, because it needs to look up Flybe in this range, and then it needs to look up the month, in this case May, and it needs to find where they intersect and return that value. So for this particular scenario, Flybe in May, the result we're looking for would be 8,390. So we're going to use XLOOKUP to do a two-way lookup effectively. And this is so simple. So let's type in equals. We're going to go for our first XLOOKUP. So lookup value. Our first lookup value is the company that we have in cell B20, comma. Where are we looking it up? Well, we're going to find that company in the companies range, B5 to B11, comma. Now, the next argument is return array. But because we want to look up more information, we have a second lookup we need to do. We go straight into our next XLOOKUP. Lookup value,
This time is the month, C20. Where are we looking up the month? Well, we're looking it up in the month range, comma. Now we can specify what we want to return. Now, the value that we want to return could be anywhere in this table because these values are going to change. I can select a different company from the drop-down. I can select a different month. So this has to be really flexible. So our return array, our value could exist anywhere. So we're going to select all of the values in here. We're going to close off our first XLOOKUP and close off our second XLOOKUP. Hit enter and we get our sales value. So let's just double check to make sure that's correct. Flybe and May, 8390. And this should work if we change to something else. Let's go for Wanderings and January, 4230, and we can see in the table that that is correct. Okay, so you can combine, if you take a look at that formula again in the formula bar, you can have multiple XLOOKUPs inside XLOOKUPs to do more than one lookup at the same time. And if you don't have the XLOOKUP function, you can do exactly the same thing using index and match. Okay, so this is really, really powerful. Now, if we go up to our XLOOKUP again, I'm just going to click at the end here. Notice that we have more arguments. So after return array, if I press comma, we have an argument called if not found. So you can add more things in here. So if the value isn't found, or if the lookup values aren't found, we could output something to the cell, maybe like not found. So instead of getting an NA error, if it can't find what we're looking for, it's going to say not found instead. So this is almost like having a built-in if NA within the XLOOKUP formula. Okay, hit enter, and that will work if the value wasn't found. All right. Final thing I want to run through with you, because we have about 5 minutes left, and this is a really important one because I get this question all the time, and that is how to deal with duplicates in lookups. Now, there are many, many different methods that you can use when it comes to performing lookups when we have duplicate values. This is just the one that I quite like. If you jump onto YouTube, there's lots of different methods that people use. But let's go through it. Now, notice here, again, I have a small table, an employee name, department, and country. Now, what we have here is we have an employee called Sonia Mullins listed 3 times. And this is a fairly common scenario, particularly if you work for a global company that has offices all over the world, and maybe you have hundreds of thousands of staff members. You're probably going to have staff members that have the same name. For example, if you were a company in the UK, you're probably going to have more than one employee called John Smith because it's such a common name. And in this scenario, we have 3 Sonia Mullins. We have a Sonia Mullins who works in sales in the UK. We have one that works in HR in the USA, and we have one that works in finance in Germany. So if I want to do a lookup here, and I'm looking for Sonia Mullins in HR, let's try our different methods and see what happens. Let's try VLOOKUP first of all. I'm going to go VLOOKUP. Our lookup value, we're going to say Sonia Mullins, comma, table array. Let's select the entire table, comma. What column do we want to return? Well, we're looking for the country, which is column number 3. And I want to do an exact match. I'm going to put a 0 on the end here because we want to exactly match the name Sonia Mullins. Close the bracket, hit enter. What do I get? I've got Sonia Mullins, HR, UK. Now, if I take a look at this, Sonia Mullins in HR is in the USA. This is the record I was looking for. But it's returning this record up here. It's returning UK. And that is because by default, VLOOKUP will always look from the top down. Okay, so it's always going to return the first one that it finds. So it starts at the top, it finds Sonia Mullins just here, it returns UK. So that's not correct. Let's try XLOOKUP and see if we can do it that way. Now, the reason why I would think of using XLOOKUP is because with XLOOKUP, we can specify which way through the table we're looking. So again, let's say the lookup value is Sonia Mullins. I want to look her up in the employee name column. I want to return the country, so we're going to select that.
But this time, I'm going to go all the way across to the search mode argument. So I'm going to skip over if not found and match mode. And we're going to go for, and another comma, search last to first. So if I put a -1 in here and close the bracket and hit enter, it's going to return Germany because it's going to find the bottom one because it's searching last to first. So that's still not exactly what we want. I want this one in the middle here. Now, I heard something come up on the, did somebody raise their hand? Let me just switch back. Is everybody still all good? You can all still hear? I heard a little bell as if somebody was asking something. No? All looks good? Audio's fine. Okay, cool. I was just worried that somebody was ringing the bell because they couldn't hear me. So, VLOOKUP will find the first one. XLOOKUP will find the last one. How do we find this one in the middle? Okay, well, the method that I like to use is I like to create a unique code for each row in my table. And I call this a helper column. Now, helper columns in Excel, you can hide these after. They just help you out when you're trying to do something a little bit more complex. So what I would do here to maybe give each of these rows a unique value that I can then use in my lookup is something really simple. I would say equals. I'm going to go for the employee name. I'm going to combine it using the ampersand symbol with the department. So when I hit enter, I now get Warren : sales, okay, because I'm combining the employee name with the department. When I copy this down, it's going to give me that same format for each row. So effectively what I've created here is a unique value for each of these employees. So now we have Sonia Mullins Sales, Sonia Mullins HR, and Sonia Mullins Finance. So now when I'm doing my lookup, I can use, let's go for VLOOKUP, why not? Because most people have that one. My lookup value is going to be Sonia Mullins. We're going to use the ampersand and combine it with the department. That is our lookup value, both of those combined. The table array now needs to include the helper column as well. Column index number, we want to return the country. This is now column number 4, and we want to do an exact match. So we're going to have a 0 on the end. And there we go. It returns the one that we're looking for. Okay, so this is how I like to do this. Now, when you have this helper column, obviously, if you want to send this to somebody else, you're not going to want all of this information just here. So you could choose to right click and just hide the column. Another little trick that you could do, which a lot of people do, is you could use custom formatting to hide the information in the cells. So let me just show you that method because you might not be aware of it. What we can do is select the column. I'm going to press Control-1, which is going to open up Format Cells. And then if we go to Custom, we can type in 3 semicolons, and that will effectively hide that information. So no one is any the wiser that it's there, but the information is still there lurking in the background. If you take a look in the formula bar, you can see that the formula is still there. We just can't see it. Okay, so that is how I like to deal with duplicate values when I'm using lookups.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all learn at least one thing that you think is going to help you. Have a great night, a great afternoon, a great morning, wherever you are, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Sez IT.